12,000 years ago, the map of the world was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not a matter of a river bending differently, or a coastline shifting by a few miles. Entire countries were missing from the map we know today because they had not yet drowned. If you had stood on the coast of Europe near the end of the last ice age, you could have walked eastward across plains that now lie beneath the North Sea. If you had lived in Southeast Asia, vast stretches of what is now shallow ocean would have been dry land, crossed by rivers, forests, animals, and human beings. Between islands that seem separate today, there were once continuous landscapes. And far to the north, locked inside glaciers several miles thick, enough water waited to raise the oceans by roughly 400 feet, or about 120 meters. Then the ice began to let go. Not all at once. Not in a single biblical wave sweeping around the planet. The transformation lasted thousands of years, but for the people living through it, the change was not always gentle. Glacial lakes grew behind walls of ice. Some became larger than modern nations. Rivers were diverted. Ice dams failed. Water burst across valleys with a violence almost impossible to imagine. In some places, floods carved landscapes in days that ordinary rivers could not have created in thousands of years. And then, during a world that was already warming, something strange happened. Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures across parts of the Northern Hemisphere suddenly fell. The cold returned. Glaciers advanced again. Forests retreated. For roughly 1,000 years, the planet entered a climatic reversal known as the Younger Dryas. One influential hypothesis proposes that enormous releases of glacial freshwater associated with the vast Lake Agassiz and neighboring meltwater systems disrupted the circulation of the North Atlantic Ocean and helped bring back the cold. The exact routes, timing, and causes remain debated, but the evidence points toward a world whose climate system was capable of changing with astonishing speed. And somewhere inside that changing world were human beings. They had no satellites, no sea-level gauges, no written calendars. They could not know that the shoreline would continue moving for generations after their deaths. They only knew that familiar hunting grounds were becoming marshes, that old paths ended at new water, that the place where grandparents remembered trees now lay beneath a bay. Thousands of years later, cultures separated by oceans would tell stories of floods. Mesopotamia remembered Utnapishtim. The Hebrew tradition remembered Noah. Greek stories spoke of Deucalion. Flood traditions appeared in South Asia, the Pacific, Australia, the Americas, and many other regions. Were these stories connected to the great melting at the end of the Ice Age? Perhaps some preserved distant memories of real local disasters. Perhaps many arose independently in societies that lived beside unpredictable rivers and seas. Oral traditions can endure for remarkable lengths of time, but tracing a particular myth directly to an event 12,000 years ago is extraordinarily difficult. So tonight, we will not pretend that mystery has an easy answer. Instead, we will follow the water. We will walk across drowned plains. We will listen to ice cracking in the darkness. We will stand beside lakes held back by unstable walls of frozen earth. We will descend beneath the North Sea to Doggerland, travel across the vanished grasslands of the Sunda Shelf, consider the debated story of the Black Sea and watch as coastlines slowly approach settlements that once seemed safely inland. And eventually, we will arrive at one of the most important questions in human history. What happens when the world you depend upon stops being predictable? Because shortly after this age of upheaval, human beings began doing something new on an unprecedented scale. They planted, they harvested, they stored food, they built villages that remained in one place. And from those villages, much later, came cities. Tonight, the story of civilization begins not with a king, not with a battle, but with melting ice, and with a shoreline disappearing beneath the sea. Imagine waking before dawn in a world that no longer exists. The fire beside you has burned almost to ash. For several hours, the coldest part of the night has settled across the valley. Frost covers the grass beyond your shelter, turning every blade silver beneath a sky crowded with stars. There are no roads, no distant glow from cities, no aircraft crossing the darkness. Nothing mechanical moves anywhere on the continent. Only wind, only animals, only human voices when someone whispers beside the embers. You are alive near the end of the last great ice age. But you do not know that. To you there is no ice age. There is only the world, and the world is cold. Across enormous regions of the Northern Hemisphere, ice dominates the horizon. In North America, a vast complex of ice sheets covers much of what will one day become Canada and reaches southward into what will someday be the northern United States. Across northern Europe, another great ice sheet spreads over Scandinavia and neighboring regions. These are not merely glaciers like those modern travelers photograph from ships. They are continental structures, frozen landscapes on a scale that challenges the imagination. In places, the ice is thousands of feet thick. Mountains disappear beneath it. Valleys vanish. The weight presses the crust of the earth downward. And contained inside all that ice is something that will eventually reshape almost every coastline on the planet. Water. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, so much of the planet's water was trapped in glaciers that global sea level stood about 120 meters, or roughly 400 feet, below its modern position. The consequences were enormous. Stand on almost any coastline today and imagine the sea moving away. Not a few yards. Not the distance exposed by an unusually low tide. Imagine the water retreating for miles. In some places, tens of miles. In other places, hundreds. The continental shelves that now lie beneath relatively shallow seas emerge into daylight. Rivers extend farther toward the distant ocean. Islands join continents. Narrow straits become plains. Places that modern people think of as ocean become grassland, marsh, woodland, river valley, and human territory. The world grows larger. At least the dry world does. Consider Britain. Today, it floats beyond the coast of continental Europe, separated from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark by water. But in the colder world of the late Ice Age, much of the North Sea basin is land. The region we now call Doggerland stretches between Britain and continental Europe. Do not imagine a narrow bridge of sterile rock. At various times, it contains rivers, wetlands, low hills, open grasslands, and later forests. Animals move through it. So do people. There is no English Channel in the modern sense separating one island culture from another. Britain is not yet an island. Farther east and south, a similar transformation reshapes Southeast Asia. Modern maps show the Malay Peninsula surrounded by seas and Indonesia fragmented into thousands of islands. But lower Ice Age seas expose much of the Sunda Shelf. Sumatra, Java, and Borneo are connected through broad expanses of land to mainland Southeast Asia, although local coastlines and river systems change repeatedly through the glacial cycle. The region becomes part of a much larger landmass, sometimes called Sundaland. Imagine looking across it from a ridge at sunrise. Mist gathers in low ground. Rivers wind toward a coastline far beyond the modern one. Tropical forests spread across valleys now submerged beneath seawater. Elephants and other large mammals travel routes that will eventually disappear below the Java Sea. Human beings travel too. They leave camps beside rivers. They gather plants. They hunt. They raise children in places where fishing boats now pass overhead. To the north, other lowered seas expose Beringia, the enormous region connecting northeastern Asia and northwestern North America. Again, the phrase land bridge is misleading. A bridge sounds narrow, temporary, something crossed quickly on the way to somewhere more important. Beringia is a world of its own. At different periods, it contains broad tundra and steppe environments supporting immense herds of grazing animals. People live within this landscape for generations, possibly for many generations. The coastline lies far beyond the one we recognize today. Across the planet, human geography is defined by spaces that future oceans will erase, and no one living there knows that erasure is coming. For most of human history, there has been no reason to imagine that seas might rise by the height of a 30 or 40-story building. The horizon seems permanent. The river seems permanent. The hill where your people bury their dead seems permanent. The stories of your elders describe the same valley. The animals follow familiar routes. Certain stones can always be found beside a certain stream. Certain shellfish can always be collected along a certain shore. A child is taught where the fresh water lies. A young hunter is taught where reindeer cross. A family remembers where berries ripen first. Knowledge is geography, and geography is survival. That is what makes the coming transformation so profound. We tend to imagine history through events. A battle occurs on a date. A king dies. A city falls. An empire begins. But the end of the Ice Age is not like that. There is no single morning when someone wakes and discovers that the Ice Age has ended. Instead, the foundations of life shift gradually, unevenly, and sometimes violently. A glacier retreats from one valley. A forest appears where tundra once stood. A river cuts a new channel. Animals alter their migration routes. A lake expands. A shoreline moves. Then perhaps it stops moving for a time. Then it moves again. To understand the people who lived through this period, it helps to forget our modern maps. Their world has no colored national borders, no coastlines printed permanently in blue. It is a living landscape. And even before the great melting accelerates, that landscape can be dangerous. Along the margins of the ice sheets, enormous quantities of meltwater collect. Some lakes are trapped between hills and glaciers. Others are held back by dams made of ice. These dams can appear solid. They can hold billions, even trillions, of tons of water. But ice is not stone. Water can carve channels beneath it. Pressure can lift it. Cracks can widen. Warm seasons can weaken it. And when a great ice dam fails, the resulting flood can exceed anything experienced by modern civilization. One of the most dramatic examples comes from Western North America. During the Ice Age, an enormous body of water known today as Glacial Lake Missoula formed in what is now Montana. A lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet blocked the Clark Fork River, creating an ice dam that may have risen hundreds of meters high. Behind it, water accumulated across valleys. At its maximum, the lake held a volume comparable to one of the largest modern freshwater lakes on Earth. Then the dam failed. Try to hear it. At first, perhaps, there is only a low vibration, a sound beneath sound, water moving under pressure through fractures in the ice, then cracking, deep and sharp, the kind of noise that carries across mountains. The dam begins to break. Water finds a path. The path becomes a tunnel. The tunnel expands. Pressure increases. And eventually the ice barrier can no longer contain the lake. The landscape opens. An unimaginable wall of water surges westward. It tears through what are now parts of Washington State and the Pacific Northwest. Modern geological evidence records the violence. Enormous channels were scoured into basalt. Gravel bars were piled to extraordinary heights. Giant current ripples formed on scales far beyond those of ordinary rivers. Huge boulders were carried within ice and deposited far from their original source. For years, many geologists resisted the idea that such landscapes could have been produced by catastrophic floods. 19th and early 20th century geology had fought hard against old traditions that explained almost every landscape through a single universal deluge. Scientists had good reason to become skeptical of flood explanations. Slow processes, operating over immense time, truly do account for much of the Earth's surface. Rivers erode, sediments accumulate, mountains weather, coastlines retreat. But nature does not choose between gradual change and catastrophe. It uses both. Eventually, the evidence for enormous Ice Age floods in the Pacific Northwest became overwhelming. And even more remarkable, Lake Missoula did not necessarily burst only once. The ice advanced again. The valley was blocked again. Water accumulated again. And the cycle repeated. Fill, break, flood, rebuild, fill, break, flood. Imagine living downstream. A lifetime might pass without witnessing such an event. A child could grow old believing the river was eternal and predictable. Then one day the horizon might darken. Animals might begin running before the people understood why. A roar might rise from the distance, and an entire familiar world could be destroyed before sunset. Whether human beings directly witnessed particular Lake Missoula floods is a question requiring careful archaeological evidence, but human populations were present in the broader Americas during the late glacial period. More important for our story is what these floods reveal. The Ice Age landscape was storing water behind temporary walls, and those walls could fail. Across North America, an even larger body of meltwater would eventually become central to one of the great mysteries of late Ice Age climate. Lake Agassiz. At different stages, Glacial Lake Agassiz covered vast areas of what are now parts of Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Minnesota, and North Dakota. Its shape changed as the ice retreated. Its outlets changed. Its volume changed. At times, it was larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. Think about that for a moment. a freshwater sea spreading across the interior of a continent. Along its shores, waves move beneath cold winds. Icebergs may drift across parts of its surface. Rivers carrying meltwater enter from the north and west. Along the southern margins of the retreating ice sheet, land newly released from beneath glaciers begins the slow process of becoming habitable. Sediment appears. Plants colonize. Animals follow. And human beings adapt. But Lake Agassiz is not simply a large lake. It is part of a planetary machine. Its water comes from melting continental ice. Its outlets connect eventually with distant oceans. And the movement of that fresh water may influence systems far beyond the lake itself. To understand why, we need to travel east, out over the North Atlantic. Even in the Ice Age, the ocean is not still. Water moves through vast circulation systems driven by wind, temperature, salinity, and density. Warm surface waters travel northward. They release heat. Cooling water becomes denser. In regions of the North Atlantic, water can sink and participate in the deep circulation of the world's oceans. This transport of heat helps shape the climate of the North Atlantic region. Now imagine adding enormous quantities of fresh water. Fresh water is less salty than seawater. And because salinity affects density, a major freshwater pulse can potentially interfere with deep water formation and alter ocean circulation. This idea has become important in attempts to explain the Younger Dryas. The broad outline is one of the strangest turns in the story of the end of the Ice Age. By roughly 14,700 years ago, substantial warming was underway in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Ice sheets were retreating. Vegetation zones were moving. The world seemed to be leaving the deep cold behind. Then, around 12,900 years ago, the climate shifted sharply in many northern regions. Temperatures fell. Cold conditions returned. The episode lasted roughly 12 centuries before ending around 11,700 years ago. Scientists call this interval the Younger Dryas, named after Dryas octopetala, a small Arctic and alpine flower whose pollen became associated with cold conditions in ancient European sediments. The flower is delicate, white petals around a yellow center, a quiet plant. Yet its name now marks one of the most dramatic climatic reversals of the late Ice Age. Why did it happen? There is still debate. One major family of explanations involves changes in North Atlantic circulation associated with fresh water entering the ocean from melting ice sheets and glacial lakes, including the enormous Lake Agassiz system. The simple version is seductive. A giant lake bursts. Fresh water floods the North Atlantic. Ocean circulation slows. Northern temperatures collapse. The Ice Age briefly returns. But the real scientific story is more complicated. Researchers have debated exactly when major drainage events occurred, where the water traveled, whether through the Mississippi system, the St. Lawrence region, the Arctic, or multiple routes, and how these freshwater pulses aligned with the onset and development of the Younger Dryas. Climate systems rarely offer a single clean lever that explains everything. Changes in winds, sea ice, atmospheric circulation, ice sheet dynamics, and the ocean may all have interacted. Still, the broader lesson remains extraordinary. A change in water moving from ice to ocean could help reorganize climate across vast distances. A lake in the interior of North America could be connected through a chain of physical processes to winter temperatures thousands of miles away. and human beings were living inside that system. They did not know its mechanisms, but they would feel its consequences. Imagine a community in Europe during the warming before the Younger Dryas. The elders remember colder years. But recently woodland has been advancing. Birch spreads, then pine. Animals associated with different habitats move into the region. People adjust their hunting methods. They learn the new forest. Perhaps certain plant foods become more reliable. Perhaps seasonal routes change. A generation grows up believing that this is simply what the world is becoming. Then the cold returns. Trees retreat. Open landscapes expand again. Winters become harsher. The ecological calendar changes. The knowledge that worked for a father may fail for his daughter. The animals arrive at different times. Plants disappear from familiar places. Lakes freeze differently. Snow remains longer. This is one of the quietest forms of catastrophe. Not destruction in a single afternoon, but the failure of expectation. Human cultures depend upon patterns. The salmon return at a certain season. The rains come within a familiar range. Herds cross a valley. Seeds ripen. Ice melts. When those rhythms change, survival becomes a problem of memory. The old stories say one thing. The landscape says another. And somewhere in that tension, human beings begin to adapt. They always have. That may be the most important truth of this entire story. Our ancestors survived extraordinary instability. They survived cold, warming, drought, flood, changing animals, changing plants, changing coastlines. They carried children across landscapes that would later vanish. They returned to camps until the camps were no longer useful. They watched rivers migrate. They watched forests arrive. And generation after generation, they learned again how to live. But the largest transformation was still ahead. As the great ice sheets melted, all that frozen water had to go somewhere. Into rivers, into lakes, into the sea. The ocean began climbing the continental shelves. Year by year, the change might sometimes seem almost invisible. A little more water at the highest tide, a salt marsh expanding, a freshwater spring becoming brackish, storm waves reaching farther inland, a favorite beach narrowing, a river mouth widening. But generations accumulate. So do inches. So defeat. Eventually, a grandfather can point toward open water and say that when his grandfather was young, people camped beyond the horizon. Perhaps he is believed. Perhaps not. Memory has always had trouble competing with landscapes that appear permanent. Yet beneath modern seas, evidence of these lost worlds remains. Ancient river channels, peat deposits, tree stumps, animal bones, stone tools, submerged forests. The seafloor is not empty. It is an archive. And as we move deeper into this story, we will enter that archive. We will follow the rising water into the North Sea. We will watch Doggerland shrink from a continental plain into islands and marshes. We will travel to Southeast Asia, where the drowning of the Sunda Shelf transformed the geography of an entire region. We will examine the Black Sea, where a dramatic flooding hypothesis once suggested that Mediterranean waters broke through with enormous force, and where later evidence has made the story far more complicated than early headlines implied. And we will ask what it might have felt like to belong to a people whose homeland was slowly becoming ocean. For now, remain here for one final moment. On the shore of the Ice Age, it is evening. The sunlight is low. Beyond the valley, the glacier glows blue beneath a pale sky. A river runs from beneath it, carrying cloudy meltwater over stones. Farther downstream, that water joins another river, then another. Eventually, it reaches the sea. A few drops mean nothing. A single summer means little. But the glacier is retreating. Thousands of glaciers are retreating. Continental ice sheets are thinning. And across the world, the ocean is waiting. The people beside the fire cannot hear what is coming. The waves are still far away. But every warm season brings them closer. And in the next chapter, we will walk into the first of the great drowned worlds. A green country beneath what is now the North Sea. A place of rivers, wetlands, hunting grounds, and human footsteps. A place called Doggerland. A land that did not fall in battle. It simply disappeared beneath the water. Long before Britain became an island, there was a country where the North Sea is now. No stone walls marked its borders. No king ruled it. No name for it survives from the people who actually lived there. The name Doggerland was given much later by modern scholars after the Dogger Bank, a broad, shallow area of the North Sea. But during the final centuries of the Ice Age and the warmer millennia that followed, this drowned region was not a bank beneath the sea. It was land. And for generations, perhaps for thousands of years, human beings knew it as home. Imagine standing there on a summer morning around 10,000 years ago. The air is cool. Mist hangs above a slow river. Willow and birch grow beside the water. Farther away, hazel and pine spread across drier ground. In open spaces, red deer move between patches of woodland. Wild boar root in damp soil. Birds rise suddenly from the reeds. The landscape is broad and low. Rivers wander lazily across the plain. Small lakes shine beneath the sky. Marshes spread through shallow depressions. In the distance, there are gentle ridges and higher islands of dry ground. If you walk west for long enough, you eventually reach the land that will become Britain. If you walk east or south, you reach what will one day be the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Belgium, and northern France. There is no sea dividing these places. Only distance. Only rivers. Only weather. Only the choices of human beings deciding where to camp, where to hunt, and where to go next. For much of the Ice Age, the region had been colder and more open. Mammoths and reindeer moved across tundra and steppe environments. Later, as the climate warmed, woodland expanded and the ecology changed. The people changed with it. This was the Mesolithic world, the Middle Stone Age of northwestern Europe. The great herds of the colder period became less central in many regions. Instead, people adapted to forests, wetlands, rivers, estuaries, and coastlines. They hunted deer and wild boar. They trapped smaller animals. They collected nuts and plants. They fished. They gathered shellfish. They moved through landscapes they knew in extraordinary detail. And Doggerland may have been particularly attractive. Lowland environments rich in fresh water and wetlands can support abundant life. River mouths and estuaries gather fish. Marshes attract birds. Woodland margins provide game and edible plants. For a hunter-gatherer community, such a place is not empty wilderness. It is a map of opportunities. Every bend in a river means something. Every ridge offers a view. Every stand of trees has a season. Every shallow channel can become a fishing ground. A modern person might cross such a landscape and see only reeds, mud, and forest. A person raised there would see stories. That creek is where a child nearly drowned. That stand of hazel is where nuts become plentiful at the end of summer. That hill is where deer pass when the weather turns cold. That spring still flows during dry years. That island of trees is where the dead are remembered. This kind of knowledge cannot be written on parchment because parchment does not yet exist. It is carried in people. It is sung, spoken, demonstrated, repeated. And perhaps during the long drowning of Doggerland, this knowledge also became a record of loss. The sea did not arrive as one single wall of water. That image is tempting because catastrophe is easier to imagine when compressed into a moment. But the drowning of Doggerland was mostly a process, a slow theft. At the end of the last ice age, the great ice sheets were melting. Global sea level rose in pulses and pauses as enormous amounts of glacial water returned to the oceans. Sometimes the rise was relatively gradual. At other times, particularly during episodes known as meltwater pulses, the rate accelerated. From the perspective of geology, even several feet of rise over a century can appear almost instantaneous. For a human life, however, the experience would be more complicated. A child born beside a river might grow old while the shoreline moved noticeably inland. Places used by one generation could become tidal in the next. Freshwater wetlands could turn brackish. Storms could reach farther. Sandbars could move. Low ground could flood more often. Then permanent water might arrive. And because Doggerland was largely low and flat, modest vertical changes in sea level could translate into large horizontal shifts of coastline. Think of pouring water onto a flat floor. The level rises only slightly, but the wet area spreads quickly. That is part of what happened here. The North Sea expanded. The land contracted, year after year, century after century. At first, perhaps, no one thought in terms of disappearance. Humans are remarkably good at treating gradual change as normal. A storm destroys a camp. The people rebuild farther inland. Salt water enters an old fishing pool. They use another. A winter tide reaches a stand of trees that elders remember as dry. The youngest people simply grow up believing that the water has always been near those trees. Each generation inherits a slightly different geography. This creates a strange problem for memory. Suppose your grandmother tells you that beyond the western marsh, where there is now an inlet, she once walked across dry grass. You believe her because she is your grandmother. But your own children never see that grass. To them, it is a story about a vanished place. Then they tell their children. By then, the inlet has widened into open water. Now the story sounds almost impossible. People once walked there? People hunted there? People built fires there? Perhaps. But the sea is there now, and the sea looks eternal. This is how landscapes become myths, not necessarily through invention. Sometimes through distance. Sometimes because reality changes faster than cultural memory knows how to explain. Modern archaeologists have recovered traces of this vanished world from beneath the North Sea. Fishing boats and dredging operations have brought up animal bones, worked antler, stone tools, and other remains from areas that were once dry land. Seismic surveys and seafloor mapping have revealed buried river channels and ancient landscapes beneath layers of marine sediment. Researchers can reconstruct valleys that no human eye has seen for thousands of years. In some places, they can identify former wetlands. Old drainage systems, low ridges, the ghosts of rivers. It is one of the strangest forms of archaeology. Instead of excavating downward through the soil of a ruined city, researchers are trying to read a country hidden beneath moving seawater. The evidence is incomplete. Much has been eroded. Much remains buried. The North Sea is difficult and expensive to investigate. Yet enough survives to make one fact undeniable. This was not merely a corridor between Britain and Europe. It was inhabited terrain, a lived world. And eventually it became smaller. Around 8,000 years ago, Doggerland had already been greatly reduced. Britain was becoming separated from continental Europe as rising seas flooded low regions. The exact sequence differed from place to place. Channels widened. Estuaries expanded. Former uplands became islands. Wetlands replaced plains. Then something dramatic occurred off the coast of Norway. Far beneath the modern sea lies evidence of one of the largest known submarine landslides in recent geological history. Today it is called the Storegga Slide. A vast volume of sediment on the Norwegian continental margin collapsed and moved downslope beneath the ocean. The causes are still studied, but the result is clear. The movement displaced enormous quantities of seawater. A tsunami spread outward across the North Atlantic and North Sea. Its waves struck the coast of Norway. They reached Scotland. Evidence of tsunami deposits has been found in several regions around the North Sea basin. And at that time, surviving parts of Doggerland still existed. Imagine the morning before the wave. Perhaps nothing seems wrong. There has been no warning carried by radio, no message from a distant observatory, no siren. A family may be gathering food near a tidal channel. A hunter may be walking through reeds. Children may be sleeping beside a dying fire. Birds move over the marsh. The sea lies beyond the horizon. Then something changes. Depending on the local geography, perhaps the water withdraws first. A tidal flat grows wider than anyone has seen. Fish are left struggling in the mud. People approach the exposed ground. Or perhaps the first sign is a distant sound. A low roar. Not thunder. Not wind. Something continuous. Growing. Animals may react before people understand. Birds rise. Deer run inland. Dogs bark toward the sea. Then the water appears. Not necessarily as a perfect vertical wall like one from a painting. Real tsunamis can arrive as rapidly rising surges, powerful bores, or repeated waves. What matters is the force. Water moving across low ground with speed and mass. Trees break. Channels reverse direction. Sediment tears free. People run toward higher land. Anyone caught in the marsh has little protection. The flood enters river mouths and pushes upstream. Salt water crosses land that had never known the sea. Debris moves with it. Branches, logs, animals, tools, boats, if boats are present, human beings. For communities living on the remaining lowlands of Doggerland, the Storegga tsunami could have been devastating. But here, caution matters. It is often said that the Storegga tsunami destroyed Doggerland. That sentence is simple. Probably too simple. By the time the tsunami arrived, sea level rise had already reduced Doggerland enormously. The land had been shrinking for generations. Some researchers argue that the tsunami may have severely damaged remaining settlements and ecosystems, perhaps making certain areas temporarily or permanently less attractive. Others emphasize that parts of Doggerland may have remained above water after the event. The final disappearance was not necessarily the work of one wave. The sea had been winning for a long time. The tsunami may have been a violent chapter inside a much longer ending, and perhaps that makes the story more unsettling, because the inhabitants may already have known that the world was changing. They may already have been retreating from the water. They may already have carried stories of lost hunting grounds. Then, suddenly, a wave arrived that seemed to confirm the oldest fears. The sea was not merely advancing. It could attack. We do not know what stories were told afterward. There are no written texts from Doggerland, no surviving names, no recorded prayers, no description by a witness. Everything personal has been erased. We have the geology, the tools, the bones, the buried channels, but not the voices. And so, for a moment, imagine one, not as fact, as possibility. An old woman is sitting beside a fire years after the flood. Around her are children who were born farther inland. She tells them that she once lived where the sun now sets over water. There had been a river there, a good one. Her father knew where salmon entered it. There were hazel trees on a ridge. Beyond them was a shallow lake full of birds. She remembers walking there with her mother. Then the sea came closer, then closer again. And one day the great water came without permission. Perhaps the children listen. Perhaps they ask how there could have been land where there is now only sea. Perhaps she points toward the horizon. There, beyond that. We lived there. This is how catastrophe can survive inside a culture, not as a measurement, not as 120 meters of post-glacial sea level rise, not as sedimentary evidence, as a sentence. We lived there. Long before clay tablets recorded kings, humans must have possessed stories about places no longer accessible. Oral societies are capable of preserving geographic and environmental information over surprising lengths of time, although determining the age of any specific tradition is extremely difficult. This is important because later, when we encounter the flood myths of the ancient world, we will face a temptation. The temptation to connect everything. A Mesopotamian flood story must come from Ice Age sea level rise. A tale from Australia must record a specific ancient inundation. A Greek myth must remember a prehistoric tsunami. Sometimes there may be genuine echoes. Some indigenous oral traditions have been interpreted by researchers as preserving memories of shoreline changes or eruptions many generations in the past. But resemblance alone is not proof. Floods are among the most common disasters experienced by human societies. Rivers overflow. Tsunamis strike. Storm surges destroy coasts. Dams fail naturally. Monsoon rains can cover plains. People everywhere live near water because water sustains life. So stories of destructive water can arise independently. Still, Doggerland gives us something valuable before we ever reach mythology. It demonstrates that entire inhabited landscapes truly did vanish beneath post-glacial seas. That is not legend. It happened. And Doggerland was only one part of a planetary transformation. Far away in Southeast Asia, another enormous lowland world was being broken apart by rising water. The Sunda Shelf flooded. Rivers disappeared beneath shallow seas. High ground became islands. Coastlines moved inland across distances that would reshape the map of Asia. And on an even greater scale, coastlines around every continent were adjusting to an ocean swollen by melted ice. There is another dimension to this story that is easy to miss when we focus only on water. the sea did not simply destroy land. It also created new worlds. As coastlines moved, new estuaries formed. New wetlands appeared. New fishing grounds developed. Marine resources became available in places that had once been inland. Human communities adapted. Some may have followed shorelines. Some exploited richer coastal environments. Some moved toward rivers. Some stayed until staying became impossible. Human history is full of loss, but also improvisation. The people leaving Doggerland were not passive victims waiting for geography to defeat them. They were highly skilled survivors. They understood weather, animal behavior, wood, stone, water, season, fire. They navigated without charts. They crossed rivers without bridges. They made tools from materials gathered from landscapes we would struggle to survive in for a single week. When shorelines shifted, they shifted too. But there is a limit to adaptation when the land itself disappears. Eventually, the routes across Doggerland broke. Open water widened. Britain became an island. What had once been a continuous human landscape became two shores facing one another across the sea. Future generations would build boats capable of crossing it. Later still would come traders, armies, invaders, empires. The water that separated Britain from Europe would become strategically important for thousands of years. But the separation itself was born from melting ice. A geological event became a historical fact. That is one of the quiet themes of this story. Geography seems permanent only because human lives are short. Mountains rise, rivers shift, deserts expand, seas open and close, and civilizations later organize themselves around the results as though they had always been there. The English Channel feels ancient, beyond imagining. The North Sea feels inevitable. Britain feels naturally insular. But these are recent conditions in geological time. There were human beings alive when they were becoming true. Tonight, the remains of Doggerland lie beneath dark water. Ships pass overhead. Fishing trawlers drag nets across sediments covering old river valleys. Wind turbines rise from parts of the modern North Sea. Far below them are landscapes from another age. Perhaps somewhere beneath layers of sand lies the place where a family once returned every autumn. Perhaps a line of hearthstones survives. Perhaps worked flint rests where someone dropped it beside a river 10,000 years ago. Perhaps nothing remains. The sea is patient. It erases, but not completely. Every so often it returns something. A bone, a tool, a piece of antler, a fragment of a world. And each fragment carries the same quiet message. The coastline is not permanent. Home is not always permanent. Even countries can drown. Now let the North Sea fade behind us. Travel southeast across continents, beyond the Mediterranean, beyond India, toward the equator. There, another lost world stretches beneath warm tropical seas. Its scale is immense. Modern Indonesia appears fragmented into islands, but during the Ice Age, much of it belonged to a single, vast landscape. Forests crossed ground where ships now sail. Great river systems flowed across what is now the Java Sea. Humans and animals moved through territories now separated by hundreds of miles of water. And as the oceans rose, that world too began to break apart. Island by island, valley by valley, generation by generation. In the next chapter, we will enter Sundaland. And there, beneath tropical rain and a rising sea, we will watch an entire subcontinent slowly become an archipelago. If Doggerland vanished beneath cold northern water, Sundaland disappeared beneath a warmer sea. Its forests were tropical. Its rivers were immense. Its animals were different. Its people lived beneath another sky. But the ending was the same. The ocean rose, and a world broke apart. Today, when we look at a map of Southeast Asia, we see fragmentation. The Malay Peninsula reaches southward towards Singapore. Beyond it lie Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Bali, and thousands of smaller islands scattered across blue water. The geography feels natural, permanent, as though the islands had always been islands. But during the colder phases of the last ice age, when global sea level stood roughly 120 meters lower than today, much of the shallow sea between these lands did not exist. The floor of the modern Java Sea was dry. Large portions of the South China Sea were exposed. Sumatra, Java, and Borneo were connected through broad lowlands to mainland Southeast Asia. Together, these lands formed an enormous region that geologists and archaeologists now call Sundaland. It was not a tiny bridge between islands. It was a subcontinental landscape. To imagine it, erase much of the blue from a modern map. Replace it with river plains, forests, wetlands, open country, coastal flats, lakes, valleys. Then move the shoreline far outward. Rivers that today empty almost immediately into the sea would have continued across broad plains for hundreds of miles. Some of those vanished river systems are still visible in the shape of the submerged sea floor. They are ghost rivers, watercourses without flowing water, channels buried beneath the sea. Once, however, they carried rain from mountains across a land that no living person has ever seen. And somewhere along those rivers, people moved. We do not know their names. We do not know their languages. We do not know what they called the mountains or the animals or the storms. But human beings had been present in Southeast Asia for tens of thousands of years before the end of the Ice Age. They had adapted to rainforest margins, river systems, caves, coasts, and islands. Farther east, human beings had reached the lands of Sahul, the Ice Age continent that joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, by crossing stretches of open water long before the final melting began. These were not helpless wanderers. They were capable navigators, observers, toolmakers, survivors of climates that changed over generations. And yet the transformation of Sundaland would present a challenge that no tool could stop. At first, the sea might seem distant. A family living beside an inland river would not wake one morning to find salt water outside its shelter. The process was often slower than that. But the direction was relentless. As glaciers melted around the world, the oceans gained water. The shoreline moved inward. Low valleys flooded. River mouths widened. Salt water entered freshwater systems. Coastal marshes shifted. People who had once lived far inland eventually found themselves closer to tidal environments. A place that a grandparent remembered as forest could become swamp. A swamp could become lagoon. A lagoon could become open sea. And in some intervals, sea level rose more rapidly than in others. Scientists studying coral reefs, marine sediments, ice cores, and ancient shorelines have identified episodes during the end of the Ice Age when global sea level appears to have risen especially quickly. One of the best known is called Meltwater Pulse 1A. It occurred roughly 14,600 years ago during a period of strong warming. The exact magnitude, duration, and sources of this event remain subjects of research, but estimates suggest that sea level may have risen by several meters over only a few centuries. That is fast on the scale of geology, and to people living in broad, low coastal plains, it could have been fast on the scale of memory as well. Imagine living beside one of Sundaland's great rivers. You are born in a village or seasonal camp several miles from the sea. Your parents know the freshwater channels. They know where fish gather after the rains. They know where wild pigs move through the forest. They know which trees produce fruit at particular times of year. When you are young, the distant coast is a place visited only occasionally. Years pass. Storm tides begin reaching farther inland. The lower river becomes increasingly brackish. Mangroves appear where other vegetation once grew. Families shift their camps to higher ground. A generation later, children fish in saltwater channels that did not exist in your childhood. The old route to a neighboring community is gone. People now travel by canoe. The world is becoming aquatic. Not everywhere at once, not in one clean line, but enough to change how people move, eat, marry, trade, and remember. This matters because geography shapes society. A broad plain encourages one kind of movement. An archipelago encourages another. When land fragments, communities that once reached one another on foot may become separated by channels. When channels widen, boats become increasingly important. When freshwater systems become estuaries, fishing practices change. When islands form, populations can become isolated. Languages can diverge. Animals can disappear from certain regions. Human relationships reorganize around water. The drowning of Sundaland was therefore more than a geological event. It was a social transformation. It helped create the maritime geography of Southeast Asia. The modern archipelago emerged gradually from an older continental landscape. And again, the people living through the transition did not have the privilege of seeing the final map. They knew only the stage they inherited. This is one of the great difficulties in imagining prehistoric climate change. We know the destination. They did not. We can look at a chart showing sea level rising over thousands of years. We can see the curve climbing toward the modern coast. We know where the water will stop. They had no reason to know. If the sea moves inland for decades, does it continue forever? If it pauses for a generation, is the danger over? If a storm destroys a settlement, is that because of long-term change or simply bad fortune? People experience climate not as a graph. They experience weather, harvests, animals, flooded paths, dying trees, changed rivers, stories from elders. That is how the global becomes local. A rise of 1 meter does not arrive with a label. It arrives as salt in a well. It arrives as a marsh where a field of edible plants used to be. It arrives as waves reaching a burial place. It arrives as a journey that now requires a boat. It arrives as a child asking why the old village is underwater. The tropical environment may also have hidden much of its archaeological record. Wood decays. Plant fibers disappear. Sea level buries coastlines. Sediments accumulate. Many of the places where Ice Age people likely lived are now underwater, difficult to access, or deeply buried. This creates a remarkable bias in our understanding of prehistory. We often reconstruct ancient life from sites that survived. Caves, rock shelters, uplands, river terraces. but coastal populations may have been especially numerous and adaptable, and the coast they used now lies beneath the sea. The ocean has removed part of the evidence. This problem is not unique to Southeast Asia. It affects archaeology around the world. When sea level was lower, humans repeatedly settled landscapes that modern researchers cannot easily excavate. The ancient shoreline is underwater, so the surviving archaeological map is incomplete. It is as though someone tore away the edges of a manuscript and asked us to reconstruct the story from the center. Sundaland may be one of the largest missing edges, and because the region lies near the tropics, where biological productivity can be immense, the drowned plains may have supported rich environments. There were forests, but Sundaland was not necessarily covered everywhere by dense, continuous rainforest at all times. Climate varied. Rainfall patterns shifted. Open woodland and savanna-like environments may have existed in some areas during cooler, drier periods. Rivers created corridors through the landscape. Animals moved along them. So did humans. The fauna of Greater Sundaland once included species whose modern distributions now seem strangely separated. Elephants, rhinoceroses, tapirs, tigers, orangutans. The changing sea helped isolate populations and reshape habitats. The islands we know today are partly ecological survivors of a once larger world. When sea levels rose, some animals became stranded on shrinking areas of land. Others disappeared. Humans, more flexible than most species, continued adapting. But adaptation does not mean absence of loss. An ancient community could survive while still losing its homeland. Those two truths can exist together, and that distinction matters. Modern accounts sometimes speak of prehistoric migration, as though people simply moved across maps. A colored arrow shifts from one region to another. But relocation is never just an arrow. It can mean abandoning familiar water, abandoning graves, leaving behind trees planted or protected by generations, losing access to stone sources, entering the territory of another group, negotiating new relationships, learning unfamiliar seasons, facing conflict, changing diets, changing stories. The map makes movement look easy. Human life makes it complicated. The gradual fragmentation of Sundaland may also have encouraged people to become increasingly comfortable with maritime environments. This does not mean that rising sea level alone invented Southeast Asian seafaring. Humans in the broader region had crossed open water long before the final ice age ended. But as plains drowned and islands emerged, water became even more central to daily geography. The sea was not only an enemy, it was a road. It carried fish, shellfish, salt, driftwood, canoes, stories, people. A drowned landscape can create a maritime culture. That is one of the paradoxes of post-glacial sea level rise. It destroys terrestrial territory while generating new coastlines. The total area of land shrinks in one place, yet the complexity of the shoreline can increase. Bays appear, straits form, islands emerge, estuaries become rich ecosystems. Human beings learn to exploit them. Loss creates opportunity. Opportunity creates new ways of life. The people of Sundaland were therefore not simply fleeing water. They were learning what the new water could provide. This is something our modern language often fails to capture. We speak of adaptation as though it were a policy. For ancient people, adaptation was 1,000 decisions. Sleep here instead of there. Fish this inlet instead of that river. Build the canoe differently. Travel in this season. Collect shellfish at low tide. Move the camp before the rains. Marry into the community across the channel. Remember which island still has fresh water during dry months. Teach the children where the old currents run. And through such decisions, societies survive the transformation of a continent. Yet there must also have been moments of sudden terror. The slow rise of global sea level was punctuated locally by storms, storm surges, earthquakes, tsunamis, river floods, and coastline collapses. Southeast Asia sits within one of the most geologically active regions on Earth. Tectonic plates meet here. Volcanoes rise along island arcs. Earthquakes can disturb the sea. A population already adjusting to a gradually rising shoreline could also experience a catastrophic inundation in a single day. Imagine how difficult it would be to separate those events in oral memory. The sea has been moving closer for generations. Then one night the ground shakes. The water withdraws. The exposed seabed glistens in moonlight. Fish lie stranded. People walk forward, confused. And then the ocean returns with tremendous force. Afterward, survivors tell their children that the sea swallowed the land. Is that story about a tsunami? About generations of sea level rise? About both? 1,000 years later, who could separate them? This is where geology approaches mythology. Not because mythology is secretly a geology textbook. It is not. But because human beings convert experience into story. Stories preserve meaning better than measurement. A community may forget how many feet the water rose. It may remember that the sea crossed a forbidden boundary. It may forget the date. It may remember that an ancestor escaped in a boat. It may forget the exact cause. It may remember that the old world ended beneath water. Across Southeast Asia and the wider Austronesian world, there are many traditions involving floods, submerged lands, ancestral migrations, and dangerous seas. It would be reckless to declare that all such traditions originate in the end of the Ice Age. Many are much younger. Many respond to local floods or tsunamis. Many belong to religious or cultural frameworks that developed long after the drowning of Sundaland. But the physical landscape reminds us that the basic image is not impossible. Land really did disappear. Human beings really did witness coastlines moving. Entire regions known to one generation really could become water for another. This gives ancient flood stories a different atmosphere. Not proof. Context. And sometimes context is enough to make an old myth feel less distant. There is another question hidden within Sundaland. Where did all the people go? The answer is not simple. Populations moved in many directions over thousands of years. Later migrations would reshape Southeast Asia repeatedly. Austronesian-speaking peoples, beginning much later than the end of the Ice Age, expanded across a vast maritime region from island Southeast Asia into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Earlier populations had their own histories, movements, and mixtures. Genetic evidence reveals complex ancestry rather than one clean migration from a single drowned homeland. So we should resist the seductive image of an entire lost civilization fleeing Sundaland and founding every later culture in Asia. That belongs more to modern myth-making than established evidence. There is no good evidence for an advanced Ice Age empire beneath the Java Sea. No drowned capital. No forgotten global civilization whose survivors taught agriculture to the rest of humanity. The actual story is less spectacular, and, in another way, far more extraordinary. Ordinary human communities endured the reorganization of a continent. They did not need pyramids to make their survival remarkable. They needed memory, skill, mobility, social cooperation, boats, fire, tools, knowledge of seasons, knowledge of plants, knowledge of one another. These are the technologies that carried humanity through climate change. Night falls across Sundaland. Let us imagine the landscape one last time before the sea completes its work. The air is heavy and warm. Insects hum beyond the fire. A river moves slowly through darkness. Far away, thunder flashes over the horizon. A child sleeps beside an older relative. Tomorrow, people will follow the river downstream. They have heard that another camp was abandoned near the coast. The water has changed there. Salt has entered the marsh. Trees are dying. Perhaps they will move soon. Perhaps they will stay one more season. People often stay one more season because home has gravity. Years pass. The river becomes an estuary. The estuary widens. The distant ridge becomes an island. Water crosses the plain. Fish swim over old paths. Coral eventually grows in places that once felt rain. Sediment covers campsites. Generations vanish. The coastline arrives at something close to its modern position, and the world of Sundaland becomes the sea floor. Today, millions of people live around the edges of that drowned landscape. Singapore rises beside straits that once did not exist. Ships cross the Java Sea above ancient rivers. Aircraft fly between islands that were once connected by forest and grassland. Modern cities look outward across water and see separation. But the water hides continuity. Beneath it lies the old land, the forgotten plain, the roads without roads, the rivers without names. And somewhere in those drowned sediments may remain traces of human lives carried away by one of the greatest environmental transformations our species has ever experienced. Yet rising seas were only one face of the end of the Ice Age. Elsewhere, water was trapped inland behind glaciers. Some of those lakes were colossal, and when their barriers failed, the landscape did not drown gradually. It was struck. In the next chapter, we will return to North America, to Lake Agassiz, to Lake Missoula, to walls of ice holding back freshwater seas, and to the terrifying moment when frozen dams failed and entire lakes began to move. There, the story of rising water becomes something faster, louder, more violent, a sound that begins beneath the ice, a crack, a deep vibration, and then a flood powerful enough to reshape the earth. There are few things on earth more deceptive than a frozen wall holding back a sea. From a distance, it looks permanent, white, massive, silent, a cliff of ice rising above cold water beneath a pale northern sky. For years, perhaps decades, the lake behind it continues to grow. Snow falls in winter. Summer warmth melts the surrounding glaciers. Streams pour into the basin. The water rises, and still the wall holds. To anyone living nearby, it might seem as reliable as a mountain. But ice is not a mountain. Ice flows. Ice cracks. Ice floats. Ice melts from above and below. Water finds weaknesses inside it. Pressure builds where no human eye can see. And when the balance finally fails, a lake can become a moving landscape. At the end of the last ice age, North America contained bodies of water so enormous that calling them lakes almost feels inadequate. They were inland seas. They occupied valleys and plains that had recently emerged from beneath continental ice. Their shorelines shifted as glaciers retreated. Their outlets changed when low passes opened or closed. And sometimes, when an ice dam gave way, water escaped with extraordinary violence. We have already met Lake Missoula. Now return there in imagination. Western North America. Cold air. Mountain valleys. A great lake spreading behind an ice dam, hundreds of meters thick. The modern landscape gives little sense of what is waiting. The water is calm. Perhaps small waves strike gravel along the shore. A herd drinks near the edge. Birds move across the surface. The lake appears still. But beneath the ice barrier, meltwater is working. Water under pressure can carve channels through or beneath ice. A narrow passage becomes wider. Friction and flowing water produce heat. The tunnel enlarges. Pressure changes. The ice above begins to lift. Then the lake finds its exit. At first, the escaping water may be confined. Then more water enters the opening. Then more. The process accelerates. Soon the enormous lake is no longer a lake. It is a flood. A flood unlike any ordinary river flood. Modern estimates for the largest Lake Missoula events suggest discharge rates of staggering magnitude, on the order of millions of cubic meters of water each second. Numbers that large are difficult to picture. So do not picture the number. Picture the landscape. Imagine water hundreds of feet deep racing through constricted valleys. Imagine rocks the size of houses being moved. Imagine gravel bars rising like hills. Imagine giant ripples forming in sediment, not inches high like those on a beach, but several feet or more. Imagine entire channels cut across hard basalt. The flood surges west, across what is now eastern Washington, through a region today called the Channeled Scablands. The name fits the landscape, a surface stripped and carved, dry waterfalls, huge coulees, isolated rock towers, basins scoured into bedrock. For a long time, this geography puzzled scientists. To some early geologists, the scale of erosion seemed almost impossible to reconcile with slow, ordinary streams. One man, J. Harlan Bretz, became convinced in the early 20th century that the Scablands had been shaped by catastrophic flooding. His idea was controversial. Geology had spent generations distancing itself from explanations that relied too easily on a single biblical flood. Uniformitarian thinking had brought a powerful correction. The present processes we see today, erosion, sedimentation, river action, and weathering, can produce immense changes given enough time. That principle remains essential. But Bretz was arguing something different. He was not trying to prove a worldwide religious deluge. He was reading a specific landscape. He saw enormous dry channels, bars, waterfalls without rivers large enough to explain them, features that suggested tremendous flows of water. The scientific community resisted. Then the evidence accumulated. Giant current ripples were identified. High water marks were mapped. Glacial Lake Missoula was recognized as the source of repeated floods. Eventually, the catastrophic flood interpretation became widely accepted. This is one of the great lessons of geology. The earth changes slowly, until it does not. A canyon may form over immense spans of time. A coast may retreat a few feet in a century. A glacier may advance gradually. And then a volcanic eruption changes an island in hours. An earthquake moves the ground in seconds. A tsunami crosses an ocean. An ice dam fails. Nature contains both patience and violence. The end of the Ice Age contained an extraordinary amount of both. Lake Missoula did not simply empty once and disappear forever. The ice dam could reform. Glacial movement blocked the valley again. The lake refilled. The dam failed again. This cycle happened repeatedly. Imagine living through one such interval without understanding the mechanism. Your grandparents remember a terrible flood. Their parents survived it. The story is repeated around fires. A lake far away broke open. Water covered the valleys. Perhaps younger people begin to doubt the details. It sounds exaggerated. How could a river rise that high? How could stones that large have moved? Then, generations later, the flood returns. The impossible story becomes reality again. We do not know whether particular communities witnessed particular Missoula floods. The chronology of human occupation and individual flooding events must be treated carefully. But elsewhere in the late Ice Age world, people certainly lived within landscapes being transformed by large floods, rapidly changing lakes, melting glaciers, and rising seas. The physical possibility of catastrophic water was part of their world. And Lake Missoula, dramatic as it was not the largest glacial lake on the continent. Farther east lay Lake Agassiz. At its greatest extent, Lake Agassiz covered an immense portion of central North America. It sprawled across parts of what are now Canada and the northern United States. Its exact shape changed dramatically through time because the lake existed beside a retreating ice sheet. As the ice margin moved north, new basins opened. Land that had been compressed beneath the weight of the ice began slowly rebounding upward. Drainage routes shifted. Outlets opened toward different river systems. Water could be redirected toward the Gulf of Mexico, the North Atlantic, or the Arctic, depending on the configuration of ice and terrain. It is difficult to imagine Lake Agassiz using a modern lakeside comparison. At times, it was larger than all 5 Great Lakes combined. Stand on one shore, and the opposite coast would be far beyond the horizon. Wind would raise waves. Storms would move across the water. Sediment would accumulate along beaches. Ice might cover broad regions in winter. Yet this inland sea was temporary. Its existence depended on the dying ice sheet. As the ice retreated, the lake changed, and eventually its water escaped. These drainage events matter not only because they transformed the local landscape. They matter because fresh water entering the oceans in enormous quantities can influence climate. This brings us again to the Younger Dryas. Around 12,900 years ago, after a period of significant warming, much of the Northern Hemisphere experienced a sharp return to colder conditions. Greenland ice cores record a dramatic change. Pollen records in Europe show vegetation shifting back toward colder environments. Mountain glaciers advanced in some regions. The cooling persisted for roughly 1,200 years. Then, around 11,700 years ago, temperatures in Greenland rose remarkably quickly as the Younger Dryas ended and the Holocene began. Why this happened remains one of the most discussed questions in paleoclimate science. One long-standing explanation focuses on fresh water. The basic mechanism is understandable even without advanced mathematics. The North Atlantic is part of a global system of ocean circulation. Warm surface water moves northward. As it cools and as its density changes, some water sinks and contributes to deep ocean circulation. Salinity plays an important role in density. Add enough fresh water to the North Atlantic or nearby regions, and the surface ocean becomes less salty. This can make sinking more difficult. If deep water formation weakens substantially, the transport of heat through the ocean can change. Northern regions can cool. So scientists have long asked whether meltwater from the great North American ice sheets and Lake Agassiz system helped trigger the Younger Dryas by disrupting Atlantic circulation. It is a compelling idea, but the real story refuses to be simple. For many years, a popular version imagined a single dramatic drainage from Lake Agassiz entering the North Atlantic through the St. Lawrence system just before the Younger Dryas. Researchers later questioned whether the required route was open at exactly the right time. Other possibilities were proposed: drainage northward into the Arctic, water moving through the Mackenzie River system, fresh water released directly from melting ice around the North Atlantic, multiple pulses rather than one single flood. Changes in sea ice and atmospheric circulation may also have amplified the cooling. The debate continues because the climate system is not a machine with one obvious switch. It is a web. Change one part, and other parts respond. Ocean, ice, wind, sea ice, atmosphere, vegetation, all interacting. This is why it is better to say that massive freshwater changes associated with the retreating ice sheets remain an important part of Younger Dryas research, rather than claiming that one lake burst on one day and caused an entire cold period. Science becomes more interesting when we allow uncertainty to remain. The mystery is not weakened by caution. It becomes sharper. Because something did happen. The warming slowed or reversed dramatically in large parts of the North. People experienced it. Animals experienced it. Plants experienced it. And the change was fast enough to matter within human timescales. Imagine a hunter living near the edge of a European woodland before the Younger Dryas begins. His childhood has been warmer than the world described by his grandparents. Trees have spread. The range of animals has changed. The landscape is becoming more wooded. He knows where deer move through the forest. He knows when certain plants appear. He teaches these things to his children. Then the climate turns. Winters sharpen. The growing season changes. Vegetation reorganizes. Open environments expand in some regions. The old timing becomes unreliable. The land his children inherit is not the land of his own youth. This is climate change before statistics, before graphs, before written language. It is experienced as confusion. Where have the animals gone? Why is the snow staying longer? Why are the plants late? Why does the lake freeze differently? Why are the winds colder? People do not need to know the cause of climate change to suffer its consequences, but they do need to respond. They alter movement patterns. They change hunting strategies. They seek new food sources. They strengthen social networks. They move. Some communities disappear from particular regions. Others expand. The archaeological record of the Younger Dryas in Europe and Western Asia shows that human responses varied greatly from place to place. There was no single human reaction. That matters because environmental stress does not automatically produce one inevitable outcome. It can produce migration, innovation, conflict, cooperation, abandonment, experimentation, sometimes all of them at once. Far to the southeast, in the eastern Mediterranean and southwest Asia, the Younger Dryas would become especially important for another reason. There, communities had already begun changing the way they use landscapes. Some groups were living in more settled or semi-settled communities. They intensively gathered wild cereals and other plants. They built substantial structures. They returned repeatedly to favored places. Then the colder, drier Younger Dryas altered conditions in parts of the region. Wild resources changed. Some landscapes became less productive. The old balance between mobility and abundance may have become harder to maintain. And somewhere in the centuries around the end of this climatic episode, people began cultivating plants in ways that would eventually transform human history. But we are not ready to enter the first farming villages yet. There is another kind of flood we need to understand. Not water bursting from an ice dam, not the slow global rise of the ocean, but the dramatic invasion of one sea into another basin. For that, we must travel toward the Black Sea. The Black Sea today is connected to the Mediterranean through the Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Dardanelles. But during periods of lower ice age sea level, its relationship with the Mediterranean was different. At times, the Black Sea basin stood lower and was more isolated. Then, as post-glacial seas rose, water eventually passed through the Bosporus. In the late 20th century, a dramatic hypothesis captured the public imagination. What if the Mediterranean had suddenly spilled over into a lower Black Sea basin? What if water had rushed through the Bosporus as an immense waterfall? What if shorelines had advanced rapidly, displacing prehistoric communities? And what if memory of such an event helped inspire later flood stories? The idea became famous. It was linked by some writers to Noah, to Mesopotamian traditions, to a lost world around the Black Sea. But as with Younger Dryas freshwater theories, the evidence proved more complicated than the most dramatic version. Researchers have debated how large the difference in water level was, how rapidly flooding occurred, and whether the Black Sea may already have been connected to the Mediterranean before the proposed catastrophic event. Some evidence supports a significant marine transgression. Other evidence suggests a less extreme or more complex sequence than the original catastrophic model. Again, the science refuses to give us a perfect bedtime legend. And that is useful, because the purpose of this journey is not to force every ancient flood into one story. It is to understand why flood stories were so imaginable. The late Ice Age world offered every form of water disaster: rising oceans, river floods, tsunamis, glacial lakes, ice dam failures, changing drainage systems, storm surges, coastal erosion. In some regions, people watched the sea advance for generations. In others, water could arrive in hours. The human mind tends to remember the dramatic event, but civilization is often shaped by the slow pressure behind it. A single flood can destroy a settlement. Repeated environmental instability can change a way of life. And the people of the late Ice Age were living inside one of the greatest episodes of environmental reorganization in human history. Now return once more to Lake Agassiz. It is evening. A cold wind crosses the water. The sun hangs low over an inland sea, whose shore is slowly changing as the glacier retreats. No one standing there could possibly see the entire lake. No one could know where every outlet led. No one could imagine the North Atlantic circulation thousands of miles away. They would know only the local signs. The water is unusually high. The river sounds different. Ice has broken along the northern edge. Birds have moved. Perhaps fish are abundant. Perhaps a familiar shoreline has vanished. Perhaps one morning the level begins falling. Quickly, the lake drains away from an old beach. Mud appears. Boats, if there are boats, sit strangely on exposed ground. A channel somewhere has opened. Billions of tons of fresh water are moving toward another basin. No one on the shore knows that this water may become part of a much larger climatic story. For them, the mystery is immediate. Where did the lake go? That question is almost beautiful in its simplicity. A sea was here yesterday. Now it is leaving. The world has changed again. And when the people tell the story, perhaps they do not speak of ocean circulation. Perhaps they say the water found a door. Perhaps they say the ice broke. Perhaps they say the earth opened. Perhaps they say a spirit released the lake. We cannot know. Their words are gone, but the scars remain. Ancient shorelines trace former lakes across modern plains. Sediments record vanished waters. Erratic boulders reveal the movement of ice. Flood channels mark violent drainage. And in distant ice cores, the chemistry of snow records sudden changes in climate. Stone remembers what language forgot. That is one reason geology can feel strangely intimate. It allows us to listen after every witness has died. The rock does not tell us what people feared. It cannot preserve a grandmother's voice. It cannot tell us the name of a child who watched the water rise. But it tells us that the flood happened. The lake existed. The ice moved. The climate changed. And sometimes that is enough to restore an entire vanished world to the imagination. Soon, however, we will move from geological memory toward human memory, from sediment to myth, from ancient shorelines to stories of boats, mountains, warnings, survival, and a world covered by water. We will enter Mesopotamia. We will meet Utnapishtim. We will hear the story of Noah. We will travel to Greece, India, Australia, the Pacific, and the Americas. And we will ask a question that has haunted scholars and storytellers for generations. Why do so many cultures remember floods? Are these simply independent stories born wherever people live beside dangerous water? Are some echoes of local disasters? Could a few contain memories transmitted across astonishing spans of time? The answer will not be simple. But before we reach mythology, one final place waits beneath dark water. The Black Sea, a basin between Europe and Asia, a body of water surrounded by ancient cultures, and a landscape where geology, archaeology, and one of humanity's oldest flood stories have become entangled in a mystery that remains unresolved. There is a place where Europe and Asia almost touch. A narrow passage of water cuts through the land. On one side lies the Mediterranean world. On the other lies the Black Sea. Today, ships pass through the Bosporus every hour. Cities rise along its shores. Bridges cross above the current. Ferries move between Europe and Asia beneath the lights of Istanbul. But thousands of years ago, this waterway did not look as it does now. And beneath the modern Black Sea lies one of the most debated flood stories in prehistoric science. To understand it, imagine the world near the end of the Ice Age. Global sea level is still lower than today. The great ice sheets are retreating. Water is returning to the oceans. Coastlines are changing almost everywhere. The Mediterranean is rising. The Black Sea basin, however, is unusual. It is a vast inland depression surrounded by land. Rivers flow into it from an enormous drainage area. The Danube, the Dnieper, the Don, and other rivers carrying water from Eastern and Central Europe. During colder periods, the Black Sea sometimes behaved more like a large freshwater or brackish lake than the marine basin we know today. Its connection with the Mediterranean depended on sea level and the elevation of the narrow channels between them. When the world's oceans were lower, the connection through the Bosporus could be restricted or interrupted. This meant that the level of the Black Sea could differ from that of the Mediterranean. And that difference is the foundation of a dramatic hypothesis. In the 1990s, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus and poured catastrophically into a lower Black Sea basin. In the most dramatic version of the idea, the event was enormous. Mediterranean water rushed northward. The Black Sea rose rapidly. Coastal plains disappeared. Communities living near the shore were forced to flee. The scale of the proposed disaster immediately captured public imagination. There was something irresistible about it. A lost shoreline, a sudden wall of water, prehistoric refugees, and perhaps the distant origin of the story of Noah. Newspapers loved it. Documentaries loved it. Popular books loved it. The phrase Black Sea deluge began to sound almost like a rediscovered chapter of the Bible. But science is often most interesting after the headline fades. Later research complicated the picture. Marine sediments were studied. Ancient shorelines were mapped. Shells were dated. The chemistry of the water was reconstructed. Archaeological sites were compared. Researchers debated whether the Black Sea had been dramatically lower before reconnection with the Mediterranean, or whether its level was already relatively high. Some studies suggested that the rise associated with marine inflow was significant, but much smaller than the earliest catastrophic estimates. Others questioned how rapidly the water would have advanced. Some evidence suggested more complicated exchanges between the Black Sea and Mediterranean over time, rather than one simple moment when a sealed basin suddenly filled. Today, the extreme version of a single overwhelming flood covering vast inhabited plains in a matter of months remains controversial. There was certainly major post-glacial change. The Black Sea's salinity changed. Marine species entered. Coastlines shifted. But exactly how violent the transition was remains debated. And that distinction is important. Because a story does not need a mile-high wave to become a catastrophe. Imagine living in a low settlement near the edge of a lake or sea. Your house stands a short walk from the water. Your family has lived nearby for decades. You fish. You gather plants from wetlands. You hunt on open ground beyond the shore. Then the water begins rising. Not 6 inches during a storm. Not a seasonal flood that retreats. It keeps coming. Week after week. Year after year. The reeds move inland. Trees standing in low ground begin to die. The fresh water near the shore becomes saltier. Paths vanish. Fishing places change. A burial ground becomes an island. A field of wild grain turns into mud. Even if the rise is measured in inches or feet per year, rather than a single towering wave, the result can still be a destroyed homeland. Human memory does not require geological drama. It requires loss. That is the quieter possibility at the Black Sea. Perhaps some communities experienced rapid inundation. Perhaps others experienced a slower but relentless marine advance. Perhaps local storms and river floods became entangled with the long-term rise. Over generations, these events could merge in memory. The water came. The old shore disappeared. People moved. That much is easy to imagine. What happened to those displaced people? Again, we must resist simple stories. It is tempting to draw arrows on a map and say that survivors of the Black Sea flood carried farming into Europe. or brought flood legends into Mesopotamia, or founded distant civilizations. But human migrations are rarely so tidy. By the time the Black Sea was approaching its modern form, farming communities already existed in parts of Southwest Asia. Agriculture had begun developing earlier in the Fertile Crescent. Neolithic lifeways were spreading through Anatolia and southeastern Europe through complicated mixtures of migration, cultural exchange, local adoption, and intermarriage. People moving away from changing Black Sea shores may have joined these wider movements. But there is no evidence that one flood created agriculture or launched civilization by itself. History almost never turns on one lever. Still, environmental pressure can push people into new relationships. Imagine several groups moving inland from different stretches of coast. They arrive in territories already used by others. Now hunting grounds overlap. Fresh water becomes more valuable. Knowledge must be shared or defended. Marriage networks shift. New settlements appear. Old ones grow. People exchange seeds, tools, animals, stories. Climate and sea level do not dictate what humans must do, but they alter the choices available. And this brings us closer to the central mystery of flood mythology. For thousands of years after the end of the Ice Age, people throughout the ancient Near East told stories in which water destroyed an earlier world. The oldest written examples come from Mesopotamia. There, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, human beings created some of the first cities. They built walls, temples, canals, archives. They pressed marks into wet clay and created records that could survive after voices were gone. And among those records are flood stories. One of the most famous appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the story, Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim, a man who survived a great flood. Utnapishtim tells him that the gods decided to destroy humanity, but the god Ea secretly warned him. He was instructed to build a large vessel. He brought aboard his family, craftsmen, and living creatures. Then the storm arrived. The flood overwhelmed the land. For days, water covered the world. Eventually, the vessel came to rest. Utnapishtim released birds to search for dry land. After survival came sacrifice. The gods gathered, and Utnapishtim and his wife were granted an extraordinary fate. The resemblance to the later biblical story of Noah is obvious. Noah too is warned. Noah too builds a great vessel. Animals are preserved. Rain and flood cover the land. Birds are released. The vessel eventually rests. A sacrifice follows. But the Mesopotamian flood tradition is older than the surviving biblical text. Versions of the story appear in earlier writings, including the Atrahasis epic and Sumerian traditions involving a flood survivor often called Ziusudra. This tells us something important. The biblical flood story developed within a wider ancient Near Eastern world where flood narratives were already deeply rooted. But why were they so powerful? One answer lies in the land itself. Mesopotamia is a river civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates bring life. They also bring danger. Unlike the relatively predictable ancient Nile flood cycle, Mesopotamian rivers could be destructive and difficult to control. Heavy rainfall and snowmelt far upstream could send water across low floodplains. Levees could fail. Canals could overflow. Mud brick settlements could be devastated. For a community living almost entirely on a flat alluvial plain, a large regional flood might appear to cover the entire world. The horizon offers no mountain, only water. Archaeologists have found flood deposits at several ancient Mesopotamian sites, but these layers do not all correspond to one single event. Different cities were flooded at different times. This supports a more grounded interpretation. Mesopotamian flood stories may have grown from repeated encounters with dangerous rivers, perhaps influenced by memories of particularly devastating local or regional floods. Over centuries, historical disaster became cosmic story. The flood was no longer simply water entering a town. It became judgment, a reset, the destruction of an age. And that transformation reveals something fundamental about mythology. Myth does not merely preserve what happened. It asks what the event meant. Why did the water come? Why did some survive? What does survival require? What should humanity do differently afterward? Geology asks how. Myth asks why. The two can touch the same disaster and carry away very different truths. Now imagine a story traveling. A merchant hears it in one city. A traveler repeats it farther west. A family carries a version into another language. A scribe changes a name. A priest gives the flood a moral purpose. A king hears it as a story about divine authority. A child remembers only the boat and the birds. Centuries pass. Nothing survives unchanged. But something remains. Water. Warning. Survival. A vessel. Dry land. A new beginning. Then move farther east. In ancient Indian tradition, there is another flood story. A man named Manu encounters a small fish. The fish asks for protection. Manu cares for it. The fish grows larger and larger. Eventually, it warns Manu that a catastrophic flood is coming. He is instructed to build a boat. When the waters rise, the fish, later associated with the god Vishnu, guides the vessel to safety. Again, we see familiar elements. Warning. Boat. Flood. Survivor. Renewal. But the cultural meaning is different. The story belongs to its own religious and philosophical tradition. It should not be reduced to a copy of Noah. Nor should we assume that it must come from the same prehistoric disaster. Flood stories can resemble one another because human beings everywhere face the same terrifying fact. Water can erase the boundary between safety and death. Travel west instead, into the Greek world. There we meet Deucalion and Pyrrha. In later Greek accounts, Zeus decides to destroy a corrupt generation with a flood. Deucalion receives warning. He and Pyrrha survive in a vessel. When the waters recede, humanity is renewed. Once again, the pattern feels familiar. Destruction. Survival. Rebirth. Yet Greece too is a land shaped by water and earthquakes. The Aegean world has known tsunamis, storms, coastal subsidence, volcanic eruptions. Any attempt to identify the myth with one particular event is speculative. The same is true almost everywhere we look. Stories of overwhelming water appear among cultures in the Americas, across the Pacific, in Africa, in Australia, in East Asia, but they are not one story. Their causes differ. Some floods are punishments. Some are accidents. Some follow broken taboos. Some involve animals. Some describe tsunamis. Some describe overflowing rivers. Some involve ancestors who climb mountains. Some involve boats. Some do not. To place every one of them beneath a single label called the global flood myth is to erase their differences. And yet their abundance still invites wonder. Why water? Why this image again and again? Part of the answer may be simple. Human beings settle near water. Rivers provide fertile soil. Coasts provide food. Lakes provide fish. Floodplains support agriculture. Waterways enable travel and trade. The places most attractive to human settlement are often the places most vulnerable to flooding. We build beside the thing that can destroy us. We have always done this. And perhaps another part of the answer lies deeper in human psychology. A flood does something that fire, drought, and war do not. It erases landmarks. A burned village is still located on recognizable ground. A battlefield still has hills. A drought leaves the road intact. But floodwater removes orientation. Where is the path? Gone. Where is the field? Gone. Where is the grave? Gone. Where is the riverbank? There is no riverbank anymore. Everything is water. For a human mind that survives by remembering place, this is terrifying. The world itself appears to have vanished. And perhaps that is why flood myths so often become stories about creation beginning again. After water comes a second world, a cleansed world, a smaller surviving group, a renewed humanity. There is a geological echo here. At the end of the Ice Age, landscapes really were being remade. Not because the gods destroyed the planet in a single storm, but because ice melted. Oceans rose. River systems reorganized. Vegetation migrated. Coasts vanished. People moved. One world did, in a meaningful sense, end. Another began. We cannot draw a straight line from Doggerland to Noah. We cannot prove that the drowning of Sundaland became a specific ancient legend. We cannot say that the Black Sea created Mesopotamian mythology. But we can say something both more cautious and more profound. Human societies at the dawn of the Holocene inherited a planet filled with memories of unstable water. Their ancestors had lived through the retreat of glaciers, through coastal loss, through regional floods, through tsunamis, through changing rivers, through storms, through the disappearance of familiar land. And oral traditions may, in some places, have preserved fragments of environmental memory for surprisingly long periods, not unchanged, not precise, but transformed into stories. Tonight, picture the Black Sea at dusk. The water is dark. A line of hills fades into the distance. Somewhere beneath the surface lies an ancient shoreline. Perhaps people once built fires there. Perhaps they repaired nets. Perhaps children played beside freshwater reeds. Perhaps an old person was buried on a hill that is now below the waves. No myth preserves that person's name. No inscription remains. Only sediment, shells, ancient channels, the chemical signature of changing water, the silent evidence of a coast that moved. And above it, thousands of years later, humanity tells stories of floods. Maybe some are only stories. Maybe some are memories transformed beyond recognition. Maybe the distinction is not always as clean as we would like. Because human beings do not remember catastrophe like a laboratory. We remember it as meaning. We remember who survived, who was warned, what was lost, what the water took, and what had to be rebuilt afterward. That last part will carry us into the next chapter. Because after the cold returned during the Younger Dryas, after coastlines shifted, after old environments became less predictable, some human communities began changing their relationship with food itself. They gathered wild grain more intensively. They stored it. They remained in favored settlements for longer periods. They experimented. They planted. They selected. And eventually, Without realizing the scale of what they had begun, they changed the future of the human species. The next great story is not about water destroying a world. It is about people deciding, perhaps for the first time on a large scale, that instead of following the landscape wherever it went, they would try to make the landscape stay. In the next chapter, we will enter the final centuries of the Younger Dryas. We will walk among the villages of the ancient Near East, and we will ask whether climate instability helped push humanity toward agriculture, not as a simple cause, not as an inevitable step, but as one of the pressures that may have helped transform survival into settlement, and settlement into civilization. There was no morning when humanity invented agriculture. No one woke beneath the last cold winds of the Ice Age, looked across a field of wild grain, and announced that from this day forward, human beings would become farmers. The change was slower than that, more uncertain, more human. It began with habits, with gathering, with returning to the same places, with watching where seeds grew best, with storing food for winter, with cutting grasses at the right moment, with carrying useful plants closer to camp, and perhaps somewhere along the way, with a handful of seeds pressed deliberately into disturbed soil. At first, the act may not have seemed revolutionary. It may have seemed practical, but in time, it would transform the planet. To follow that transformation, we must travel to Southwest Asia near the end of the Pleistocene. We enter the region later called the Fertile Crescent. This broad zone stretches through parts of the Levant, northern Mesopotamia, southeastern Anatolia, and the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. It contains mountains, river valleys, grasslands, woodlands, lakes, and seasonal wetlands. And growing wild across parts of this landscape are plants that will become some of the most important crops in human history: wild wheat, wild barley, lentils, peas, other edible grasses and legumes. For hunter-gatherers who understand the seasons, these plants are not background vegetation. They are food stores growing beneath the sun. Imagine arriving at a patch of wild cereal in late spring. The stalks move in the wind. The landscape has turned pale gold. Seed heads are heavy. A person passes through them with a stone-edged harvesting tool. Another carries a basket. Back at camp, the grain is processed. The husks are removed. Seeds are ground between stones. Flour may be mixed with water. It may become porridge, or a simple form of bread. Long before full agriculture, people in this region already possessed sophisticated knowledge of plant foods. They knew when cereals ripened. They knew where they grew. They knew how to collect them efficiently. They knew how to grind them. They knew how to store food. Agriculture did not appear because people suddenly became intelligent. The intelligence had been there all along. What changed was the relationship between knowledge, landscape, climate, and population. One important cultural tradition in this story is known today as the Natufian. Natufian communities flourished in the Levant beginning before the Younger Dryas, roughly 15,000 years ago. They were hunter-gatherers. But some lived in settlements that were more substantial and more permanent than the old stereotype of wandering Ice Age bands would suggest. They built stone structures. They used grinding stones. They collected wild cereals. They hunted gazelle and other animals. Some communities returned repeatedly to the same locations. Some buried their dead near settlements. They created places with history. This matters, because the shift toward settled life began before domesticated agriculture was fully established. The familiar story in which people first invented farming and then immediately built villages is too simple. In parts of Southwest Asia, settlement and intensive gathering preceded agriculture. People were already experimenting with a different rhythm of life. Instead of moving constantly across enormous territories, some groups spent longer periods in productive locations. That offered advantages. A rich wetland could provide birds, fish, plants, and game. Nearby hills might support wild cereals. Stone could be gathered from known sources. Water might remain available through much of the year. But settlement also created vulnerabilities. A mobile group can respond to shortage by moving. A more settled group has invested in place. Its houses are there. Its storage is there. Its grinding stones are there. Its dead are there. Its neighbors know where it is. Children grow up with particular springs, hills, paths, and hunting grounds. The longer people remain, the more difficult leaving may become. Then came the Younger Dryas. Around 12,900 years ago, the climatic reversal we have followed across the Northern Hemisphere began. In the eastern Mediterranean and parts of Southwest Asia, conditions changed. The exact environmental effects varied across regions, and no single pattern describes every valley or settlement. But many areas became cooler and in some places drier. Vegetation shifted. Water availability changed. The abundance and distribution of useful plants could become less predictable. For communities already relying heavily on particular local resources, that mattered. Imagine a settlement that has returned to the same stand of wild grain for generations. The people know its rhythm. After winter rains, young plants appear. By spring, the hills change color. At the right moment, harvesters move out with baskets and sickles. Seeds are carried home. Some are eaten. Some are stored. Some fall near paths and buildings. Now imagine several difficult years. Rain arrives differently. The wild stands are thinner. The best patches grow farther away. Competition with neighboring groups increases. Children still need food. Old people still need food. The settlement cannot survive on memory alone. What do people do? One possibility is greater mobility. Some communities may move. Another is dietary diversification. Gather different plants. Hunt different animals. Fish more intensively. Another possibility is cultivation. Encourage the plants that already matter. Clear competing vegetation. Disturb the soil. Move seeds. Return to places where useful species grow. Harvest carefully. Protect favored patches. None of these actions require someone to understand genetics. But genetics begins responding anyway. Wild cereal plants have evolved efficient ways to reproduce without human help. When wild wheat ripens naturally, for example, its seed-bearing structures tend to break apart. The seeds scatter. That is useful for the plant. It is less useful for the human harvester. If you collect plants with seed heads that remain intact slightly longer, however, you may unintentionally favor a different trait. Those intact seed heads are easier to harvest. Their seeds are more likely to be carried back to the settlement. If some of those seeds are later planted, deliberately or accidentally, plants with human-friendly characteristics gain an advantage. Generation follows generation. Human selection begins changing plant biology. Eventually, the crop is no longer simply a wild plant growing near people. It has become domesticated. But this process takes time. The archaeological record suggests that cultivation and domestication were prolonged processes, not a single discovery. Different crops were domesticated at different rates. Different communities experimented in different places, Some early cultivation may have begun before clear biological signs of domestication appeared. The transition from gathering to farming is therefore blurry. That blurriness is important. Human history often looks clean only when viewed from far away. Hunter-gatherer, farmer, village, city, civilization. But real people live between categories. For generations, a family might gather some wild foods, cultivate others, hunt gazelle, tend a small plot, collect nuts, fish in a stream, and move seasonally. Was that family farming? Perhaps partly. History does not always respect the labels we create for it. There is another reason to be cautious. The Younger Dryas did not simply cause agriculture. Scientists have proposed climatic stress as one important factor in the development of cultivation in Southwest Asia, but the relationship remains debated. Some researchers emphasize population pressure. Some focus on increasing sedentism. Some highlight social competition, feasting, storage, and changes in community organization. Others point to the accumulation of ecological knowledge over many millennia, and agriculture did not emerge in only one place on Earth. Independent domestication later occurred in several regions. Rice and millet in parts of China, New Guinea highland crops, maize in Mesoamerica, potatoes and other crops in the Andes, African cereals in parts of the continent. Different environments produce different pathways. There was no single agricultural revolution commanded by one climate event. Yet in Southwest Asia, the timing remains fascinating. People had lived through the unstable climate of the late Ice Age. Some had already become relatively settled. The Younger Dryas brought renewed climatic stress. Then, near its end, and during the warming that followed, cultivation intensified in several areas. By the early Holocene, fully domesticated crops and increasingly agricultural communities were becoming established. The climate warmed again, and this time the warming was abrupt. Around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended. Greenland ice cores reveal just how rapidly major climate conditions changed in the North Atlantic region. The Holocene began. This is the geological epoch in which nearly all recorded human civilization would develop. For many regions, the new epoch eventually brought warmer and comparatively stable conditions, although the Holocene was never completely free of droughts, floods, cooling episodes, and regional climate disruptions. Still, compared with the enormous swings of the late Pleistocene, the environmental stage became different. Glaciers continued retreating. Sea level continued rising. Forests expanded into many northern regions. Ecosystems reorganized. And human beings increasingly began reorganizing ecosystems themselves. Consider what farming changes. A hunter-gatherer enters a landscape and reads it. A farmer begins to edit it. Trees are cut. Soil is disturbed. Seeds are selected. Water is redirected. Animals are excluded from certain areas. Other animals are encouraged to remain nearby. Useful plants become concentrated. Unwanted plants are removed. The distinction is not absolute, because hunter-gatherers also manage landscapes in sophisticated ways, including controlled burning, transplanting, pruning, and selective harvesting. But agriculture can intensify that relationship dramatically. The landscape becomes an investment. And investment encourages permanence. If you spend weeks clearing a plot, you want a return. If you plant seeds, you must remain long enough to protect and harvest them. If you store hundreds of pounds of grain, moving becomes more difficult. If you build a substantial house, place a heavy grinding stone beside it, and bury relatives nearby, the settlement gains emotional and economic weight. Home becomes architecture, and architecture changes society. Now the community must decide who uses which land, who controls stored food, who maintains shared structures, who receives grain during scarcity, who owns the harvest. Can food be inherited? Can surplus be exchanged? Can it be stolen? Can one family accumulate more than another? Agriculture does not automatically create inequality, but stored surplus makes new forms of inequality possible. Grain is especially important in this regard. A herd of wild animals can walk away. A patch of ripe wild plants may disappear within days. Stored grain remains. It can feed people months later. It can support larger populations. It can survive seasons of shortage. And it can be counted, measured, guarded, distributed, controlled. From this simple fact, distant possibilities begin to emerge. Granaries, property, taxation, administration, eventually writing, not because wheat magically creates empires, but because stored food changes what human communities can organize. Population can grow. More people can live close together. Specialists may spend less time acquiring food. Craft traditions expand. Trade networks deepen. Political authority can become more concentrated. None of this happens immediately. Thousands of years separate the first experiments with cultivation from the first cities of Mesopotamia. But the direction has changed. The human relationship with uncertainty has changed as well. Remember the central problem of the late Ice Age. The world would not stay still. Coastlines moved. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Plant communities shifted. Animals changed ranges. Lakes broke. Water arrived where land had been. For most of human existence, adaptation meant moving with those changes. Agriculture offered another strategy. Do not only follow food, produce it. Do not only discover abundance, create it. Do not only remember where plants grow, make them grow here. This is not absolute control. Farmers remain deeply dependent on climate, sometimes more dependent than mobile foragers. A failed harvest can be catastrophic. A field cannot escape drought. A village cannot easily follow migrating animals. Agriculture solves certain problems by creating others. Disease can spread more easily in dense settlements. Stored grain attracts rodents. Repetitive diets can produce nutritional problems. Close relationships with animals create new opportunities for pathogens. Labor can become physically demanding. Conflict over land can intensify. For many early farmers, life was not necessarily healthier or easier than the lives of hunter-gatherers. So why continue? Because once farming systems support growing populations, returning entirely to an older mobile way of life can become difficult. More people live on the land. Territories fill. Fields expand. Children learn farming knowledge. Storage systems deepen dependence on harvest cycles. The experiment becomes a way of life. Then it becomes tradition. Then ancestry. One generation plants because planting is useful. Another plants because their parents planted. Another because the village has always planted. Eventually, no one remembers a world before fields. This is how revolutions often happen. Slowly enough that the participants do not know they are inside one. Imagine such a village near the beginning of the Holocene. Morning light touches stone walls. Smoke rises through openings in roofs. A woman kneels beside a grinding stone. Grain cracks beneath the pressure. Outside, children carry baskets. Someone repairs a sickle fitted with small, sharp stone blades. Another person checks stored food. Others move toward fields where cereals stand beneath the sun. There is no writing, no money, no king, no city wall. But much of the future is already present in miniature. Permanent buildings, managed food, storage, cooperation, territory, inheritance, memory fixed to place. The village is an argument with uncertainty. It says, we will remain here. The climate may change. The rains may fail. Animals may move. But we will plant again. And that decision echoes far beyond the village. Centuries pass. Agriculture spreads through migration and cultural exchange. Different communities adopt it at different speeds. Some resist it for thousands of years. Some combine farming with hunting and gathering. Some return to greater mobility. There is no single frontier moving neatly across a map. Yet slowly, cultivated landscapes become more common. In the Levant, in Anatolia, across parts of Europe, farther east and south through other pathways, humans begin transforming ecosystems at scales their Ice Age ancestors could scarcely have imagined. The strange irony is that this new age of greater settlement begins while the oceans are still rising. The ice has not finished melting. Doggerland is still shrinking. Coastlines are still adjusting. Lowlands are still being lost. Human beings are putting down deeper roots on a planet whose edges are still moving. Perhaps there is something deeply familiar in that. We build permanence inside impermanence. We always have. Tonight, stand at the edge of one of those early fields. The sun has gone down. The settlement is quiet. Beyond the houses, grain moves beneath the night wind. Farther away, wild animals still travel through darkness as they have for thousands of generations. Above them, the stars are unchanged. But below those stars, something has shifted. A few acres of earth are no longer entirely wild. Human hands have chosen what should grow there. Seeds have been selected. Soil has been disturbed. A harvest is expected. And expectation may be the most important word. During the late Ice Age, people survived by learning what the landscape was doing. Now, increasingly, they are asking the landscape to do something in return. Grow here. Ripen then. Feed us later. The old unpredictability has not disappeared. It never will. But humanity has begun constructing a buffer against it. Food stored against winter. Seed saved against hunger. Walls built against weather. Community organized around place. From these experiments, thousands of years later, will come Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Uruk, cities, kingdoms, writing, laws, armies, temples, empires, and every one of them will depend upon a much older act, someone placing a seed into the ground and returning to see whether it grew. The Ice Age did not create civilization by itself. The Younger Dryas did not force humanity to farm. Floods did not suddenly invent cities. But environmental instability formed part of the world in which people experimented with new ways of securing food, organizing communities, and staying in one place. Climate created pressures. Human beings created responses. And from those responses came consequences no one could have predicted. In the next chapter, we will follow those consequences forward. We will watch villages become larger, surplus become power. Water becomes something humans no longer merely feared, but attempted to control with canals, levees, reservoirs, and irrigation. And we will encounter one of history's greatest paradoxes. The civilizations born from humanity's struggle against environmental uncertainty would build themselves beside rivers and seas. The very waters that nourish them could still destroy them. The flood had not vanished. It had simply moved from the wilderness to the gates of the city. The first cities did not rise far from water. They rose because of it. Rivers fed their fields. Floodplains renewed their soil. Canals carried water where rain could not be trusted. Boats moved grain, wood, stone, people, and stories. And yet, the same water that made civilization possible remained capable of destroying it. This was the paradox at the heart of the ancient city. Human beings had survived the end of the Ice Age by adapting to a changing world. Now, thousands of years later, they were attempting something more ambitious. They were trying to organize the world, to measure it, divide it, redirect it, store it, predict it, and whenever possible, control it. Imagine standing on a flat plain in southern Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. The horizon is wide. The land is dry beneath the sun. There are no great forests, little stone, almost no reliable rainfall. Yet in the distance, rising above the plain, stands a city. Mud brick walls, temples, houses packed along narrow streets, smoke, voices, animals, boats. Thousands of people living closer together than almost any hunter-gatherer community could have imagined. How can so many people survive here? The answer is water. The Tigris and Euphrates cross an otherwise difficult landscape. Their waters make agriculture possible, but they are not gentle rivers. Their floods can be irregular. Channels shift. Banks collapse. Silt accumulates. A canal that works one year may require repair the next. Too little water brings crop failure. Too much water can destroy homes, fields, storage rooms, and livestock. So people dig. They build embankments. They clear channels. They direct water toward fields. They maintain levees. They organize labor. And the larger these systems become, the more coordination they require. This is one of the quiet ways water helped shape government. An irrigation canal is not simply a ditch. It is an agreement. Someone must decide where it goes. Someone must maintain it. Someone must settle disputes when one field receives more water than another. Someone must organize repairs after a flood. Someone must count grain. Someone must decide what portion is stored for bad years. As settlements grow, such decisions become increasingly important. Authority becomes attached to water. Administration becomes attached to food. And memory becomes attached to records. Eventually, human beings begin writing down what must no longer be forgotten. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia was closely associated with accounting. Grain, animals, labor, goods, quantities. Before writing became poetry, law, royal propaganda, or history, it helped manage the practical machinery of settled life. A mark on clay could record an obligation. A tablet could preserve a transaction after the people involved had gone home. Information no longer had to live only in memory. This was another kind of adaptation. For tens of thousands of years, survival depended on people remembering the landscape. Now, increasingly complex societies needed ways for institutions to remember. Who owes grain? Which field belongs to whom? How many workers are required? What was delivered? What remains in storage? A city has a larger memory problem than a small band. Writing helped solve it. And once writing existed, something extraordinary became possible. Floods could become texts. Stories that had once lived only in voices could be impressed into clay. A disaster could outlive the storyteller. A myth could survive the language of a particular generation. The old human fear of overwhelming water entered civilization's archive. We have already met Utnapishtim, but now consider why his story belonged so naturally in Mesopotamia. The city dwellers who heard it lived in a world shaped by both irrigation and flood. Every canal was a reminder that water could be directed. Every levee was a reminder that it could escape. Civilization did not eliminate environmental danger. It concentrated exposure to it. A mobile community may lose a seasonal camp. A city can lose thousands of homes. A farmer may invest an entire year in one harvest. A granary can hold the future of hundreds of families. When disaster comes to a settled society, more is fixed in place. More can be lost at once. The same was true elsewhere. In Egypt, human life followed the Nile. The rhythm differed from Mesopotamia. For much of ancient Egyptian history, the Nile's seasonal flooding was relatively predictable. Water rose. It spread across the floodplain. It left fertile silt. Then it retreated. The agricultural year was built around this cycle. Too low a flood could mean hunger. Too high a flood could destroy settlements and infrastructure. But a favorable inundation was not catastrophe. It was renewal. This difference shaped the way people imagined water. The Nile was dangerous, but also profoundly generous. Egyptian civilization depended on understanding its rhythm. People watched the river, measured it, recorded levels, organized labor around the agricultural cycle. Again, water and administration became intertwined. And again, the lesson was the same. A civilization is not separate from its environment. It is an arrangement made inside it. Move east toward the Indus Valley. There, too, major urban settlements emerged in landscapes shaped by rivers. Cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were part of a sophisticated urban civilization with planned streets, drainage systems, standardized construction, craft specialization, and far-reaching trade. The exact relationship between climate change, river shifts, and the later transformation of Indus urbanism remains complex and actively studied. Older narratives sometimes imagined one simple climatic collapse. The evidence instead points toward regional variation, changing monsoon patterns, altered river systems, migration, and gradual reorganization. Once again, there was no single day when a civilization simply ended. Cities shrank. Populations redistributed. Settlement patterns changed. People adapted. History rarely resembles a door slamming shut. It more often resembles a landscape slowly losing one path and opening another. Farther east, rivers shaped early societies in China. The Yellow River carried enormous quantities of sediment. It could nourish agriculture. It could also change course dramatically and produce devastating floods. Later, Chinese historical tradition would remember Yu the Great, the legendary figure who controlled a great flood not by merely blocking the water, but by channeling and directing it. The story is deeply connected with ideas of political legitimacy. A ruler proves worthy by making the waters orderly. Whether the legend preserves memories of a specific ancient flood, multiple disasters, or later political symbolism remains debated. but its cultural meaning is clear. Civilization is presented as the act of turning dangerous water into an ordered landscape. This idea appears again and again. The king controls the river. The state builds the canal. The priest predicts the season. The community maintains the embankment. Order holds back chaos. But water does not care about political theory. It does not recognize walls as permanent. And sometimes the greatest systems fail. A levee breaks. A canal silts up. A drought lasts too long. A river changes course. A reservoir empties. A storm arrives beyond the range of memory. Then the old fear returns. Imagine the sound of a city during a flood, not the silence of a drowned prehistoric plain. A city is louder. People shout from rooftops. Animals panic in enclosed spaces. Storage jars break. Mud brick walls weaken as water enters them. Furniture floats. Grain becomes wet. Streets become channels. A current pushes through doors. Families carry children toward higher ground. Temple steps become islands. Boats move where people walked the day before. The water turns familiar architecture into something strange. This experience helps explain why flood myths remained powerful even long after the Ice Age. People did not need inherited memories of melting glaciers to understand the terror of inundation. Agricultural civilization recreated vulnerability in every river valley. The old theme returned in new forms. Only now there were walls to lose, fields to lose, archives to lose, warehouses to lose, temples to lose. A flood could threaten not only life, but the entire order of society. And yet water remained essential. This is perhaps the deepest connection between the end of the Ice Age and the rise of civilization. Humanity did not escape water. It entered a more complicated relationship with it. During the glacial world, people often moved around environmental change. During the agricultural world, they increasingly built systems to resist, redirect, and absorb it. Irrigation, drainage, storage, dikes, terraces, canals, reservoir, wells. These are all technologies of negotiation. They say to the environment, "We know you are uncertain. We will try to prepare." This ability to prepare is one of civilization's great strengths. But it also creates confidence, and confidence can become dangerous. If a levee has held for 100 years, people build behind it. If a floodplain has remained dry for generations, homes spread across it. If a coastline is changed slowly, harbors expand. If drought has not arrived within living memory, storage may seem unnecessary. Human beings are exceptionally good at forgetting rare disasters. This was true in antiquity. It remains true now. There is a phrase sometimes used in risk studies: the disaster that exceeds memory, not because no one has ever experienced anything like it, but because no one alive remembers. A flood arrives beyond the marks carved on old walls. A storm travels farther inland than anyone expects. A river reaches a level older people said was impossible. Suddenly, history becomes practical. Old sediments matter. Old stories matter. Old maps matter. This brings us back to myth. Suppose a community tells a flood story for 500 years. At first, perhaps the story begins with an actual disaster. Then details change. Gods enter. Moral lessons develop. Heroes become larger. Numbers become symbolic. The story grows. A later generation may no longer treat it as a warning about a particular river. But hidden inside the narrative is still one important idea. the water has risen before. This may be one of the oldest functions of storytelling, to preserve danger after witnesses disappear. Not precisely, not scientifically, but memorably. A child may forget the measured height of a flood. A child will remember that the water reached the sacred tree. A village may forget the year. It will remember that everyone who stayed on the low ground died. Stories can carry practical wisdom beneath layers of myth. They can say, "Do not build there. Climb when the sea withdraws. Keep boats ready. Respect the river. Do not assume the old shoreline is permanent." In some modern indigenous traditions around tsunami-prone regions, oral knowledge has indeed helped communities recognize dangerous signs and move to higher ground. This does not prove that every ancient flood myth is a coded disaster manual, but it reminds us not to dismiss traditional memory simply because it speaks in a different language from geology. Science and story are not the same, but sometimes they look at the same landscape. One reads sediment. The other remembers a warning. Now move forward several thousand years. Cities become larger. Empires expand. Roads cross continents. Harbors fill with ships. Human beings gain increasingly powerful ways to alter landscapes. Marshes are drained. Rivers are straightened. Forests are cleared. Dams are built. Coasts are fortified. The old dependence on climate does not disappear. It becomes less visible. Food arrives from farther away. Water moves through pipes. Grain moves through markets. Disaster can seem distant until the system fails. A resident of an ancient city at least knows the river beside the wall. A modern city may depend on watersheds hundreds of miles away. It may rely on dams built generations earlier. Its food may come from several continents. Its electricity may depend on reservoirs or coastal infrastructure. Complexity protects us. Complexity also connects failures. The larger the system, the farther consequences can travel. There is an echo here of Lake Agassiz. Water moving in one place alters conditions far away. A freshwater pulse affects ocean circulation. A crop failure affects trade. A damaged port affects supply chains. A drought affects energy. A flood affects migration. The modern world is different from the Ice Age world. But interconnectedness is not new. Nature has always been interconnected. Human civilization has simply built its own networks inside those older ones. And now, in the modern age, the sea is rising again. The reason is different from the natural end of the last ice age. Today, human activities are rapidly increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, warming the atmosphere and ocean. Mountain glaciers are shrinking. The Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are losing mass. Ocean water expands as it warms. Global mean sea level rises. The total rise so far is tiny compared with the roughly 120 meters that separated the last glacial maximum from the modern coastline. But that comparison can be misleading. Modern civilization has placed enormous populations and infrastructure directly along present shorelines. Ports, airports, subways, roads, power plants, homes, factories, tourist districts, entire island communities. We have built as though the current coastline were fixed. Doggerland would have recognized the mistake. Consider Bangladesh. Much of the country occupies a low, densely populated delta formed by the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna river systems. The region already experiences cyclones, river flooding, erosion, and saltwater intrusion. Sea level rise interacts with these hazards rather than acting alone. Or consider the low islands of the Pacific. For many communities there, climate change is not an abstract question about the distant future. Rising seas can increase coastal flooding. Saltwater can affect freshwater lenses. Erosion can threaten homes, roads, and graves. The loss is cultural as much as physical. A homeland is not replaceable simply because people can move somewhere else. Doggerland teaches this too. Land is memory. Then there is Florida, a modern landscape of millions of people, expensive property, highways, resorts, wetlands, and cities built only slightly above the sea. In parts of the state, porous limestone complicates the use of traditional seawalls because water can move through the ground. Again, geography matters. There is no universal engineering solution. Every coast has its own geology. Every community has its own vulnerability. Every adaptation involves choices. Which places do we defend? Which places do we redesign? Which places become too expensive to protect? Who pays? Who moves? Who gets help? Who is forgotten? These are technological questions, economic questions, political questions. But beneath them lies the oldest human question in this entire story. What do we do when home moves? The people of the late Ice Age answered by adapting generation after generation. Some moved. Some changed diets. Some became more maritime. Some intensified plant use. Some eventually cultivated landscapes. Their populations were small. Their buildings were limited. Their infrastructure could often be recreated elsewhere. Modern civilization faces the same basic environmental force with vastly more fixed investment. We have more knowledge, more technology, more warning, and far more to move. That is why the past is useful. Not because our future will repeat the end of the Ice Age exactly. It will not. The causes differ. The rates differ. The distribution of ice differs. Our societies differ beyond recognition. But the past destroys one comforting illusion. Sea level is not fixed. Climate is not fixed. Coastlines are not permanent. A map is only a temporary portrait. At the end of the last Ice Age, a person could stand in a forest where the North Sea exists today. That is not mythology. A person could travel through lowlands connecting islands that are now separated by warm tropical water. That is not mythology. Lakes larger than modern nations could drain through changing glacial outlets. That is not mythology. Climate could shift significantly within the span of generations. That is not mythology. The Earth has done all of these things, and human beings lived through them. Tonight, imagine an ancient city after the river has fallen. The flood is over. Mud covers the streets. Walls have collapsed. Broken pottery lies beneath silt. People emerge from higher ground. The first work begins. A doorway is cleared. A child is found. A body is buried. Wet grain is examined. A damaged canal is repaired. Someone begins rebuilding a wall. Someone tells the story of what happened. And somewhere, perhaps, a mark is made showing how high the water reached. That mark may be forgotten. The wall may eventually disappear. The city may become ruins. The language may die. But the impulse remains. Remember the height. Remember the water. Remember that it can happen again. In the final chapter, we will return to the beginning of our journey. To the ice. To the drowned forests. To the old stories. To the question of whether flood myths preserve memories of a lost world. And then we will look toward the modern shoreline, not with panic, not with prophecy, but with the perspective that only deep history can provide. Because 12,000 years ago, humanity learned a lesson written across the continents. The world can change beneath your feet. And survival begins by noticing that it already has. There is a forest beneath the sea, not a metaphorical forest. A real one. Its roots once held soil. Its branches once moved in wind. Birds may once have landed there. Children may have walked beneath its shade. Someone may have stopped beside one of those trees and looked toward a horizon that no longer exists. Today, in places around the world, storms and shifting sands occasionally reveal ancient tree stumps along modern coastlines. Elsewhere, sonar and sediment cores show buried river valleys beneath shallow seas. Peat layers appear underwater. Pollen survives. Animal bones emerge from fishing nets. Stone tools are recovered from sea floors that were dry land when human beings first knew them. The ocean keeps pieces of the old world. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to remind us that the coast is not a line. It is a moment. And tonight, after traveling through melting ice sheets, glacial lakes, vanished plains, cold reversals, flood legends, and the first experiments with agriculture, we return to that simple fact. The map moves. We often speak of the end of the Ice Age as though it were a chapter that closed. It did not close. Its consequences are beneath our cities, beneath our harbors, beneath the North Sea, beneath the Java Sea, along the shelves surrounding nearly every continent. The modern coastline is, in large part, the shoreline left behind after the great post-glacial rise in sea level. It is the latest arrangement, not the final one. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, global sea level stood roughly 120 meters lower than today. Then warming began. Ice sheets lost mass. Water returned to the ocean. Over thousands of years, sea level rose by approximately 400 feet. It was not one single flood. There was no universal wave racing around the earth. There were pauses, accelerations, regional differences, meltwater pulses, storms, tsunamis, river floods, ice dam failures, and local disasters layered on top of global change. That distinction matters because the real story is more powerful than a simplified one. People did not need one worldwide deluge to experience the end of a world. They needed only to lose the one landscape that mattered to them. For one community, that world may have been a river valley in Doggerland. For another, a low tropical plain in Sundaland. For another, a lakeshore beside a retreating glacier. For another, a settlement near a river that overflowed farther than anyone remembered. Human beings experience planetary change locally, always. A graph may show global sea level. A family sees the grave of an ancestor being reached by the tide. A climate record may show cooling. A hunter notices that the animals are late. A scientist may reconstruct rainfall patterns. A farmer sees seed fail in dry soil. A satellite measures ice loss. A child notices salt in the drinking water. This is how history becomes personal. And perhaps this is also how history becomes myth. Return now to the old flood stories. Noah, Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, Ziusudra, Manu, Deucalion, and the many flood traditions that belong to communities across the Pacific, Australia, Africa, East Asia, and the Americas. It is tempting to place them all on a table and search for one key, one event, one flood, one origin. But that search may misunderstand what stories are. Human cultures are not hard drives copying perfect data from generation to generation. Stories breathe. They change with the people who tell them. Details expand. Names shift. Gods enter. Moral lessons are added. Old disasters merge with new ones. Memories become symbols. Symbols become rituals. A story may survive for a very long time while becoming almost unrecognizable from whatever experience first inspired it. So when we ask whether ancient flood myths preserve memories of the end of the Ice Age, the best answer is neither yes nor no. It is more careful. Some flood traditions may preserve memories of real environmental events. Some may remember relatively recent river floods, tsunamis, storm surges, or coastal changes. Some may contain remarkably old observations. Some may have spread between neighboring cultures. Others may have arisen independently. And for stories supposedly carrying memories across 10,000 years or more, the burden of proof must be high. Similarity is not enough. A boat in one myth and a boat in another do not prove a shared prehistoric disaster. Water is universal. Boats are universal where people live near water. Floods recur. Human beings tell stories about survival, but beneath that caution lies a fact that should not be forgotten. The physical world that would make such memories possible actually existed. People truly inhabited lands that later drowned. This matters. For generations, theories about lost lands have attracted fantasy, sunken kingdoms, advanced Ice Age empires, forgotten technologies, cities beneath oceans. The appeal is understandable. A blank space invites invention. But we do not need an imaginary super-civilization to make the lost world astonishing. A family is enough. A fishing camp is enough. A hearth is enough. A set of footprints beside a vanished river is enough. The disappearance of ordinary lives is what makes deep history intimate. Civilization did not begin with giants. It began with people much like us in the ways that matter most. They loved places. They learned seasons. They feared hunger. They protected children. They remembered the dead. They argued. They explored. They adapted. And they inherited environmental problems they had not created. When the Younger Dryas brought colder conditions back to parts of the Northern Hemisphere, no council of prehistoric leaders caused it. When an ice dam failed, no community downstream had voted for the flood. When the sea entered Sundaland, no hunter had chosen global sea level. Yet people still had to respond. That may be one of the most useful lessons deep history can offer. Human beings do not choose every change, but they choose within change. Sometimes badly, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes too late, sometimes just in time. The communities of the late Ice Age survived not because they could prevent climate change, but because flexibility was woven into their way of life. They moved. They changed foods. They changed tools. They changed routes. They formed relationships. They learned coastlines that had not existed before. They abandoned places when necessary. And in some regions, they began experimenting with a new strategy. Stay, plant, store, build. Agriculture was not a simple answer to climatic catastrophe. It developed through long processes involving environment, population, social choices, accumulated knowledge, and cultural experimentation. But it represented a profound change in humanity's relationship with uncertainty. Instead of relying only on what a landscape offered naturally, people increasingly tried to shape future abundance. They save seeds today to survive months from now. They stored grain against bad seasons. They invested labor in a place. Then came villages, larger settlements, specialization, irrigation, administration, cities, states, civilization. And with civilization came another great transformation. Humans became capable of changing the environment on a scale their Ice Age ancestors could never have imagined. Forests were cleared. Rivers were redirected. Marshes were drained. Fields spread. Cities expanded. Eventually coal was burned. Then oil. Then gas. Machines multiplied. Industry altered the chemistry of the atmosphere. The human species became not merely an observer of climate, but an important force acting upon it. And so the distant past and the present meet. Not because modern climate change is simply a repetition of the natural warming that ended the last ice age. It is not. The great post-glacial warming involved natural changes in Earth's climate system as the planet emerged from glacial conditions. Modern warming is being driven primarily by human greenhouse gas emissions. The causes differ. The social context differs. The speed of modern change is especially important because billions of people now live inside infrastructure built for a relatively stable historical climate. But the Ice Age still gives us perspective. It tells us what ice contains. Sea level. A glacier is not simply scenery. An ice sheet is water stored on land. When land ice loses mass, part of that water reaches the ocean. When oceans warm, the water itself expands. And rising water does what it has always done. It finds the lowest ground first. Today, our low ground is crowded. Consider the great deltas, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna, the Mekong, the Nile, the Mississippi, the Yangtze. River deltas are fertile because water and sediment built them. They are also vulnerable because they are low. Many are sinking in places because of groundwater extraction, sediment loss, and other human influences. Sea level rise adds another pressure. Then consider island communities in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. A few feet of elevation can separate daily life from repeated coastal flooding. Saltwater can contaminate freshwater. Erosion can reach roads and homes. Storm waves arrive on top of a higher baseline. To someone living there, sea level is not an abstract global average. It is the distance between water and a doorway. Then look toward Greenland, toward Antarctica. There lies enough ice to reshape the planet if substantial portions were lost over long periods. No responsible comparison suggests that the entire Ice Age rise of roughly 120 meters is about to repeat in a human lifetime. That is not what the evidence says. The great ice sheets respond over different timescales, and future sea level depends strongly on future warming and ice sheet behavior. But the direction of the physical relationship is straightforward. Warmer world, less land ice, higher sea. Deep history has already demonstrated the principle. The question now is not whether coastlines can move. We know they can. The question is how much they will move, how quickly, and what human societies will do about it. And perhaps most importantly, what will we choose to remember? Because forgetting is part of the danger. A coastline remains stable for several generations. People build closer. The oldest flood becomes a legend, then a joke, then nothing. The seawall has never failed. The storm has never reached this street. The glacier has always been there. The island has always had fresh water. The river has always stayed inside its banks. Human beings are drawn toward the phrase always. Geology is suspicious of it. Geology knows that always usually means within living memory. And living memory is very short. The rocks remember farther. So does ice. So does sediment. A core drilled from Greenland contains layer after layer of ancient snow compressed into ice. Tiny bubbles trap old atmospheres. Chemical signals reveal changes in temperature, dust, volcanic activity, and precipitation. Mud at the bottom of lakes traps pollen from vanished forests. Ocean sediments preserve shells from organisms that lived in different water conditions. Corals record ancient sea levels. Submerged landscapes reveal former rivers. Everywhere, the Earth keeps records. The planet is full of archives written without words, and we have only recently learned to read them. Perhaps that is the true mystery of the flood stories. Not whether one ancient tale is secretly a precise record of a particular geological event, but that human beings and the earth have both been remembering. One in story, one in stone. Sometimes the two memories seem to approach each other. A tradition says water once covered the land. Geology finds a drowned plain. A story speaks of a terrible wave. Sediment records a tsunami. An elder says the coast once lay farther away. Ancient shorelines are found offshore. Sometimes the match is persuasive. Sometimes it is coincidence. Sometimes we simply do not know. And there is something beautiful about allowing that uncertainty to remain. Not every mystery needs to become a conspiracy. Not every myth needs to become literal history. Not every scientific question needs an immediate final answer. Wonder survives caution. Sometimes it grows stronger because of it. Now imagine the world again at the end of the Ice Age. Night. A fire. The smell of smoke. A group of people sitting together near a shoreline that will not survive. An old person tells a child about land farther out. The child has never seen it. The story sounds strange. Once, the old person says, you could walk beyond the bay. There were trees there, and deer, and a river. The child looks toward black water. Nothing is visible. Only stars reflected on the surface. Years later, that child grows old. The coastline is moved again. Now the story is repeated to another generation. The details may change. Perhaps the old river becomes greater in memory. Perhaps the flood becomes faster. Perhaps an ancestor becomes a hero. But the central truth remains. There was land where there is now water. Thousands of years pass. Languages disappear. People migrate. Religions rise. Cities grow. Kings are crowned. Empires fall. Ships cross the sea. And far beneath their hulls are the old trees, the riverbeds, the peat, the bones, the stones shaped by human hands, the world that disappeared. This is where our journey ends, not with a final answer, with a shoreline. Stand there in imagination just before dawn. The modern ocean is quiet. A few waves move across the sand. Far beneath them lies an older coast. Farther still lies another, and another. Each one marks a different moment in the long conversation between ice, water, land, and time. Behind us rise cities filled with light. Ahead of us lies the dark sea. Between them stands a human being, small, temporary, but able to remember, able to measure, able to learn, and able, perhaps, to prepare. 12,000 years ago, The ice let go. The oceans rose. Lakes broke their barriers. Cold returned and then retreated. Landscapes vanished. People moved. People adapted. Some eventually planted. Villages became cities. Stories became writing. Floods became myths. And myths became echoes carried into our own age. The old world is still down there, quiet beneath the water. It does not ask us to fear the future. It asks us to understand change, to notice what seems permanent, to question the word forever, and to remember that every coastline is temporary. Every civilization is an experiment. Every generation inherits a world already in motion. The tide continues to move in the darkness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ice is cracking. Somewhere, a river is changing course. Somewhere, the sea is touching ground that yesterday was dry. And somewhere beneath the waves, a forgotten forest remains rooted in the earth, waiting, silent, remembering the last time the world changed. Thank you for staying with Calm History Nights all the way to the end of this journey through a world shaped by ice, water, memory, and time. If this story helped you relax, drift towards sleep, or simply see the ancient past a little differently, please consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription. Your support helps us continue creating long, peaceful history stories for quiet nights like this one. And if you know someone who loves lost worlds, ancient mysteries, and calm storytelling, feel free to share this episode with them. Until our next journey into the past, rest well, sleep peacefully, and thank you for spending your night with Calm History Nights. Good night, and may history carry you gently into dreams.